listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the capital of the divided states of America, it is time for another hour, another show, another edition of the most disruptive show covering news and events across those divided states, as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
Left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, with that out of the way, getting directly into the headlines this morning. First up in COVID news, the United States COVID death toll passed 300,000 yesterday, with at least 1,678 new coronavirus deaths and 201,000 new cases reported in the U.S. on December 14th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 209,600 new cases per day. That's an increase of 31% from the average 2 weeks earlier. Fresh data revealed that more than 1/4 of Americans say they probably or definitely would not take a coronavirus vaccine. That is according to a survey released on Tuesday by the Kaiser Family Foundation, which found that Republican, rural, and Black Americans are among the most hesitant to be vaccinated. The skepticism, while not totally unanticipated, still represents a challenge as the country tries to tamp down exploding infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. On the same day as the first inoculations were administered, the United States passed 300,000 deaths, more than any other country, as we just mentioned. I also just want to point out here, I saw a New York Times headline coming in yesterday. I didn't know exactly how to fit it into headlines, so I kind of left it out, but I'm bringing it up now, about how businesses were considering whether or not to mandate people taking a vaccine, which, you know, we've been talking about that on the show. I'm opposed to that. But one of the sides of that, they said, is that if approximately 75% of the population got vaccination, the medical authorities, the head honchos in charge here, would feel pretty much okay about that. They would figure, okay, that's enough for us to resume some sense of normalcy. That's enough, enough herd immunity is the term that they use for this, that we can just sort of, it's not going to be like everything's normal again, but, the economy can pick back up, et cetera. If 25% of people don't want to take it, that's fine. That leaves about 75% of people who would take it, the theory goes, which fits the parameter there. So if we see businesses mandating it, then that'll probably get messy. And it also seems unnecessary to me, taking that into account. Does that make sense, Jamarl? What do you think?
You mean like X number of people get it, and so it becomes less important to kind of force it? Exactly. It's the forced choice thing. Like, it's like, hey, we're going to give you this option of doing this. It's like, okay, but what happens if I don't do it? There will be punishment. So how is it it's not a choice. It's like, I get it though. If you get X number of people doing it, then it becomes less of a priority to try to force people to do it. Which is, look, I'm against forcing people to take vaccines. It just almost is an absolute. This is my libertarian stripe coming out of me. But it does make sense, the 75% stuff. I just don't like this idea that you're going to force people to do it. That seems disturbing to me.
Yeah, same thing with wearing masks, honestly. I mean, admittedly, a vaccine is like way more invasive than asking somebody to wear a mask. But still, I don't know. I'm against forcing people to do things in general, unless, it's like pay taxes or not kill other people or something like that. Then it gets into immediate
kind of asking people to not kill other people. I don't know. I think putting something in your body is different than wearing a mask. I'm not saying, I don't want people.
I hear it.
Yeah, I don't want, and don't get me wrong, I don't like the forcing thing either. So don't misunderstand me. And I think forcing thing creates complications. Because when you force it, there's always a pushback. Meaning you're going to have the people.
Always.
It's
especially
like
especially with intransigent Americans, especially in this country, and I like it. I'm not even really criticizing that, but it's just, it is what it is. Anyway, next headline here. Entertainment sector employees in Paris have gathered to protest coronavirus restrictions imposed in France. Cultural venues were expected to reopen on Monday, but new measures have taken effect, advising the entertainment sector there to remain closed until early January. Sweden, meanwhile, has seen excess mortality of 10% due to COVID, with 8,088 deaths in November. It is the highest number of deaths measured in the month of November since the Spanish flu in 1918. In national political news, you might have seen this yesterday, U.S. Attorney General William Barr is stepping down before Christmas, the president has announced. Mr. Barr's term was due to end on 20th of January when Trump leaves office. Tensions between the two flared after Mr. Barr said there was no evidence of widespread fraud in November's vote. He was criticized by Trump for not publicly disclosing during the election campaign that the Justice Department was investigating Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. Mr. Trump tweeted Mr. Barr's resignation letter saying, quote, "Our relationship has been a very good one. He has done an outstanding job," end quote. This says the Electoral College formally confirms a victory for Biden. Also a big headline yesterday. Again, that effectively hammers the last nail into the coffin, as far as I can tell at least, of Trump's reascending to the office of the presidency in 2021. It seems like he is going to be stepping out, but we'll come back to that. In our next headline, Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday congratulated Joe Biden on winning the U.S. presidential election in November, saying he hoped the countries could set aside their differences to promote global security. However, with these next couple of headlines, admittedly, this is stuff happening in the tail end of a Trump administration, but I'm not sure how well these next few headlines forebode for that relationship. This next one, the Department of Homeland Security was successfully breached as part of a major attack on U.S. federal agencies, Reuters reported Monday. And that breach was by all intelligence authorities that I have access to, by all the ones being quoted by these news outlets at least, was done by suspected Russian hackers, and I'll come back to that. Reuters cited people familiar with the matter in reporting that hackers believed to be working for the Russian government had successfully gained access to internal communications within DHS. Department of Homeland Security spokesperson Alexei Woltornost did not directly confirm the breach, but told The Hill that, quote, "The Department of Homeland Security is aware of reports of a breach," end quote, and, quote, "are currently investigating the matter," end quote. The report comes the day after Reuters first reported that both the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration had also been breached as part of an attack backed by a foreign government. The Washington Post attributed the breach to a prolific Russian military hacking group known as Cozy Bear, quote unquote, also known as Advanced Persistent Threat 29, APT 29. And again, I'm going to sound like I repeat myself when I go back into this. I talked about this a couple of times yesterday, but I guess I'm going to have to be doing it some more, and this is probably not going to end today. APT 29, otherwise known as Cozy Bear, is not necessarily an actual group of people. We don't know that it's a single group of people. It's basically, when they use the phrase advanced persistent threat, what they mean is they see malware that is sort of more or less consistently used coming from specific servers. But those same servers could be hired out by multiple parties. And in a lot of these cases, as far as I can tell, in most of the cases, the malware that's used is publicly available. So anybody can download it, anybody could use it. And I'm just going to throw in a couple of other options here. It could be a single group, or it could be multiple groups who have mutual awareness of each other's actions based on, for instance, prolific news reporting over the years, or it could be an intelligence agency that these intelligence agencies don't know about, trying to spoof the activities of the supposed group, using publicly available malware and those publicly available servers to try to do a sort of false flag style thing. There's so many ways this could go, and it's actually very hard to tell what specific evidence the intelligence agencies are going on, because so much of it is anonymously sourced, and even then, when you look into the ones that aren't anonymously sourced, or they give some specifics, they don't really give enough specifics to actually let you know what's going on. Now, admittedly, they have reasons to want to do that, or to want to not do that. They are intelligence agencies. They want to keep their sources secret, their methods secret, et cetera, et cetera. But from my perspective, looking at this more or less journalistically, it's just not that much to go on. And, I distrust intelligence agencies per se. So trying to give people the facts on this one. In another related sort of anti-Russian headline coming out yesterday, Trump administration issued sanctions against Turkey's military acquisitions agency on Monday to punish the NATO ally more than 3 years after it bought a missile defense system from Russia. The economic and travel penalties against Turkey's presidency of defense industries and 4 of its top officials were as much a warning to other nations, including India, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, that are considering buying arms and other military equipment from Moscow. Jamarl, I'm going to turn to you for a minute. After those last couple of headlines, and after everything we've seen from Joe Biden over the last 40 some odd years, where do you think he's going to take his administration when it comes to Russia? What do you think his stance is going to be?
This is going to get worse. I don't think this is going to get better. So I know this is going to sound weird. It sounds like a tangent, but it's within the same vein. There was a report that made the point that China would have more influence in the Biden administration than it ever did in the Trump administration. And the argument had to do with basically Wall Street, that the companies and everything else that is dumping money into China and that is making a ton of money in China wants to keep making that cash, and that having these kind of trade wars and everything else basically creates difficulties in making cash in this kind of even keel way. That Trump was letting ideology, or let's say geopolitical ideology and his ego get in the way of the real thing in Washington, cash. That's not going to be an issue for Biden. And so the question becomes, does that influence, does that connection in any way deal with, let's say, Russia? Meaning, is there this kind of weird tangent by the influence from the standpoint of China having an effect in the Russian thing? Or are those two completely different spheres? Now, if they are two completely different spheres, then you're going to see a ratcheting up of tensions. Meaning, everything that has gone on from the standpoint of Trump and Russia is not going to just evaporate. Like this notion that Trump and Russia ends the moment Joe Biden wins is insane. You're going to have Democrats who right now still want to punish Julian Assange because in their heads, Julian Assange got Donald Trump elected. It is the most ludicrous, ridiculous thing on the planet, which is, I got to be honest, part to the reason why Trump should pardon Assange, and he should pardon Snowden. He should pardon both. But I guess my thought is the way Democrats and the hysteria that have taken place over the last 3 years with them using this as this conspiracy theory that they fervently believed. No, I don't think that stops when Trump leaves. I think that keeps going. I think that animosity continues with this idea that in their heads, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government somehow got Trump elected. It's ludicrous, but the reality of it doesn't entirely matter. The question becomes, what effect does that have on Biden, knowing that he has these people in his back? And these are the woke crowd. Like, this is the resistance. This is his main group. Like, this is not like lefties or whatnot. These are, the wokest of the woke, the pea-hat wearers. So, yeah. I mean, keep going. I'm sorry.
I hear you. No, you're totally good. I kind of want to come back to this. I just got a couple of more headlines to get through here. Australia's prime minister said Tuesday that China would be violating World Trade Organization rules and a bilateral free trade agreement if it banned Australian coal after China's state-owned newspaper said Beijing's main planning agency had given power plants approval to import coal without restrictions except for Australian coal. Interesting there. Want to see where that goes.
If Trump can do it, China can do it, just as a heads up.
I hear you, but I kind of wonder, there's just more to this story, and I want to know what more there is to this story.
I know.
The history
and
what the back and forth is. French fishermen threatened to blockade channel parts if there is a no-deal Brexit after the UK refused to agree to demands by France for EU vessels to be allowed the right to large fish quotas from British waters after the UK leaves on January 1st. In Delhi, in India, around 5,000 nursing staff from Delhi's All India Institute of Medical Sciences Hospital have declared an indefinite strike over salaries. Again, as India is hit by the coronavirus, interesting move. In Iran, Tehran intends to complete in 2021 a strategic project to transport oil bypassing its key energy route, the Strait of Hormuz, due to the instability in the area, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said on Monday. And I can't help but think that's largely U.S.-caused instability, the naval back and forth with the U.S. and us trying to assert our naval supremacy in the region. Again, that does add some instability, unpredictability to their oil exporting abilities. The national Iranian oil company sent a crude tanker to Venezuela to load it with 1.9 billion liters, I believe, of oil, despite U.S. sanctions. In China's 500-meter aperture spherical telescope that is called FAST is the world's largest radio telescope and has opened its doors to foreign astronomers to attract top talent from around the world. The news comes after the U.S.-owned Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico was destroyed after its 900-ton receiver platform broke and fell 140 meters into its radio dish this month, destroying the device. I'm sure you saw that, Jamarl. That was definitely a sad event. I grew up seeing that thing occasionally in movies and science TV shows and kind of wanted to go visit it and didn't. And, anyway, part of the longer story of stagnation in the sciences in the Western Hemisphere. Last headline here, the UK telecommunication regulator Ofcom will have the power to make tech firms responsible for protecting people from harmful content such as violence, terrorism, suicide content, cyberbullying, and child abuse under a new bill to be presented to Parliament next year, the UK government announced on Tuesday. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going into a break here. We'll be back on the other side of this break with Jamarl Thomas's monologue. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back in just 1 minute.
Fault lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share this audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Call in. I like to say we don't bite, or at the very least, we never bit anyone that hasn't deserved to be bitten. So one of the interesting things that has been taking place over the last few days has been this kind of broadside on AOC, this push, this want for AOC to get aggressive, and other members of the squad, but AOC has been the focal point of this, to basically flood the zone, to stop Pelosi from being Speaker of the House, and to use that vote, to use the leverage that they believe that they might have at their disposal to basically force a vote on Medicare for all in lieu of her leadership position. Now, I'm not quite sure who else is running against Nancy Pelosi, and I don't necessarily know if the Democratic leadership is going to put a Republican in. But I do think there's something that goes a little bit beyond that, or questions that should go beyond this. Yesterday, 300,000 people have lost their lives to COVID-19. A few days ago, there were 3,100 people that died that day, more people that died from 9/11. And at this point, over 2,000 a day are dying. And which means that on a scale of 9/11, nearly, or let's say 80% of 9/11, nearly every day for the foreseeable future, and going back for the last several months, we have lost Americans. Now, we killed 1 million people, and we spent nearly $9 trillion when we lost 3,000 just once in 9/11. And yet, we could not muster the gumption, the will, the ability, the capacity to deal with this issue. Now, Democrats like to blame Trump. It's all Trump. It stops at the border of Trump. And I do think there's something to be said for that. I think if a ham sandwich was president of the United States, we would have probably still lost less, which means that any random person, meat with eyes, that was just general and nominal in their capacity and skills could have basically kept this number of people from dying. That's my conjecture. That's what I believe. I believe the most modicum of things, of just listening to the people who know, would have helped you out. Not entirely focusing on the wealth of the nation and the economics of it all. Meaning, how could we put bucks in the hands of the rich? And more importantly, even when you did get the PPP pass, what happened? The rich, the oligarchs of the world, weasel their way into it, with big business taking the overwhelming majority of the money for struggling companies. 40% of those companies apparently aren't coming back. Would those companies have stood a chance if those PPP loans, and if the money, not the PPP loans, but if the money that went out for those companies, if those actually was, by the CARES Act, kept by those small businesses? Interestingly enough, with the 300,000 people dying, you have Joe Biden now coming in. Help is on the way, apparently. Now, the help that's on the way is a vaccine that was done under the Trump administration. And apparently, Biden, who, I got to be honest, don't quite know what he means by help. He says build back better. I have no idea what that means, just like I didn't know what hope and change meant. But Biden is in, and the other resistance members are apparently extremely excited that Trump is leaving. My question becomes, what are we to expect from the Biden administration, and why are we to be so excited that Biden is coming in? Politico, right here, Biden's White House staff so far, venture capitalist Ronald Klein, former pharmaceutical lobbyist Steve Ricchetti, top Democrat recipient of big oil Cedric Richmond, co-founder of the firm that represents pharma and private equity. These are the names of people who Joe Biden has been bringing into his cabinet, just in case they weren't familiar. Here's some more. Co-founder of the firm that represents big defense and big tech, Abe Blinken, ex-consultant for data miner, Planter Tech. You have a senior VP for the firm that represents embattled Swiss-based mining giant Glencore. You have managing director of the massive New York financial firm. You have ex-senior advisor for the massive New York financial firm. You have CEO of DC think tank that has taken billions of dollars from banks, big techs, defense contractors, and of course, foreign governments. Oh, we can keep going. I'm trying to make the point to you that all of these lefties and all of these other progressive groups decided to back this guy. And the person and the people who this guy's putting in are basically people who you would expect in a Republican presidency, or pretty much a Jeb Bush presidency. Nancy Pelosi, the person who's going to be likely Speaker of the House, comes out after 300,000 people have died and says, our hearts are broken for the families of the 300,000 Americans who have lost their lives to COVID-19, and we are praying for them and all of those who have been infected, and the courageous essential workers putting their lives or putting themselves at risk of infection. What's the problem here? The problem here is that Nancy Pelosi, unless I am unaware of this, is not a priest. She's not a preacher. Nancy Pelosi is not in seminary school somewhere. She's not a religious leader. You're a politician. Your job isn't prayer. Your job isn't even the sin prayers. Your job is policy. Your job is to legislate. Your job is, when you see 300,000 people die, is to get on the podium and to be aghast by it, to go to the hospitals, standing in the ICU and screaming at Joe Biden, we must pass Medicare for all with COVID. If you don't want to do Medicare for all, fair enough. But you need to explain why you can't do Medicare for all with COVID, and why prayer is a better option. I don't believe prayer is a better option. I believe policy is a better option. If I want to have my soul saved, or if I want to be prayed for, I can go to my mama for that. If I need Medicare for all, that's when you go to legislators, and that's when you push legislatures to do their job. Joe Biden, the other person who's just won election, makes the point of saying 7 Senate Republicans, mostly senior, have called him tonight. He spoke to one of the most senior members who expressed a willingness to work on China and infrastructure. Listen to this. I love this part. It's going to take 6 to 8 months, but the GOP will work with him. You're going to be surprised. Think about this. Joe Biden is telling people, hey, it's going to be a bipartisan administration. We're going to get some great bipartisan things done. You know, one of the great bipartisan things they're talking about doing, you know that bill, that stimulus that was supposed to be $2.4 trillion. Now it's like 800 billion. That's the bipartisan compromise, 800 billion. I suspect when they say, Joe, we're going to do good things together, it's going to be things like that. They remember Joe Biden in Congress. They know who Joe Biden is. He spent 47 years in that Congress working with them, passing that horrendous legislation, backing those horrendous policies like a balanced budget amendment or executions, or for that matter, the criminal justice thing, or putting people in prison a long time, or chastising Ronald Reagan to execute Americans. I guess I'm saying they know who Joe Biden is. They know the type of man he is. They know the type of man and the things that he wants. And they look at him and say, Joe, we're going to do great things together. And Joe Biden says, I know that we are. Now the catch becomes with the creatures that Joe Biden are putting in his administration, what kind of great things do you think they're going to be doing? Whatever you think of this notion of pushing AOC, I do think it's somewhat unfair. Not so much that you shouldn't push your politicians. Lord knows you should do that. And not even so much that it's a bad idea. I actually think it's a good idea. Lefties need to get into their heads. Pressure, leverage is what politics is about. Not this begging and beseeching that has taken place over the last 50 years. And if that needs to start here, fair enough. But I do think that there needs to be an honest inquiry into why do you have like 100 members of the Progressive Caucus and you're stuck yelling at like 2 people to basically do this. Joe Biden is coming into the administration who basically, after working with the Republicans, in order to try to push back Trump, after bringing in Republicans to the DNC, after openly going for Republicans, Rahm Emanuel saying it's going to be the year of the Biden Republican. What do you think he's going to get done? And this is stuff that was taking place in the election. So this is not even something where you say, well, I didn't know Joe Biden was going to do that. No, Joe Biden told you he was going to do that because Joe Biden said that before the election. And right now, he's going to be working with Republicans. Your question is, what is he going to be working with them on? How do you have 100 members of the Progressive Caucus and yet you're screaming at 7 people or 6 people, and really, if we're being honest, just 1, to do something? Yes, you should push. But there's something more than that. On day 1, the honest argument should be that Joe Biden, and honestly, whether Nancy Pelosi, and this is kind of the reason why I'm like, yeah, all of these people should be pushed on some level. Nancy Pelosi, who's in Congress, is saying send prayers. Joe Biden is saying in 6 to 8 months, I'm going to be working with Republicans on something. Who knows? Build infrastructure. When the stimulus that he's making right here, pushing job by basically the Senate creatures, is basically for less than $800 billion. I get the pushing of AOC. Fair enough. But let's just be very clear. It goes far beyond AOC. And it goes into something that is deeply, deeply problematic with our political system, whether you're talking about the right or the left. But in this very specific instance, the idea that Joe Biden doesn't come in and pass Medicare for everyone with COVID-19 through executive action and force Republicans to rip it away in court is just sad, pathetic. And there's something to be said for pushing the left on this. Shane, what do you think? He has the power to do it. Trump brought it up. Sending prayers doesn't seem to be a viable political option to dealing with 300,000 people dead.
No, you need politics for that. But like you said, there's something rotten in Denmark. There's something more deeply messed up than either what individually AOC got wrong or frankly, even what the Democrats as a party are getting wrong. There's something messed up with both parties and messed up with the military industrial complex. Everybody who's listening to me already knows that stuff. I don't need to belabor the point. What I kind of want to do, and this is not what you were directly talking about for most of this, but we should come back to the Jimmy Dore Medicare conversation because I can see, I guess, we don't have enough time for it right now, but I still don't see I still don't think it's useful. I think I see more of the points of it, but I still don't think that it's the most useful move. And I think it's a mistake for folks to be focusing on so heavily, but maybe that's yesterday's news. Regardless, we'll be coming back to another opportunity to talk about this stuff in a little bit. For now, we're going into a break. We'll be back on the other side of this break with Brad Blakenship talking about China and the United States and our economies. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Blakenship. We're joined by Bradley Blakenship, Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose columns can be found on RT and CGTN.com. By the way, you can also follow Brad on Twitter at @BradBlank_. That is the character _. And you can find his writing on RT.com and CGTN.com. Brad, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Hey, I'm doing great. How you guys doing?
Good. Better for having you on with us. All right, let's get straight into it. We have a couple of articles from you. Both of these posted, by the way, over at CGTN.com. Both within the last week and focusing on a couple of sort of economic asymmetries between the United States and China. America, for one thing, as of December 10th, the Dow Jones indices, the S&P Dow Jones indices, removed some Chinese companies from their index products after an executive order from Trump issued in November. Second major index to do so after FTSE Russell. I'll just start with that. What are the effects of this going to be, both in the short term and in the long run? I mean, this is being used as a weapon against China. Mm-hmm. But from the title of your article, which, by the way, if people want to check it out, title is "America's Global Finance Leadership Put at Risk by delisting, Chinese companies," quote unquote. By that title, it seems like you think that America is going to be hoisted by its own petard, that we're going to be hurting ourselves in the long run with this move. What's your take, Brad?
Right. So I think, first of all, what was most interesting for me to see about this is the fact that after this happened, there was absolutely no effect at all on the Chinese financial market. You would have expected normally for companies to be delisted in the United States. You would expect them to take huge hits in their own home financial market. And that didn't happen. Actually, these companies went up afterwards. The second point about what's going to happen, I think, in the long term, former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson actually wrote about this the day before this happened. He wrote an opinion in the Wall Street Journal and said that U.S. financial leadership is, quote, increasingly being challenged by fierce competition from abroad and by short-sighted and counterproductive policies at home. And he specifically mentioned this exact policy by Trump and said, it plays good politically at home because there's a giant populist wave against China, both on the right and the left, for some reason. This plays politically, but it's quite bad because if you think about everything that's going on right now in the world, the United States is in a really bad spot economically, especially if we look down the road. So by delisting companies that are competing with American companies, that makes, our allies even skeptical of investing in the United States. We've seen financial or foreign capital start to drop investing in the United States since the financial crash in 2008. That's people started to realize, hey, the United States is not a really great place to invest in because, they're allowing their bankers to break the law. They've decriminalized some kinds of risk, creating just wildly extravagant financial products that honestly shouldn't even be, a thing that people are investing in. it's just a wildly turbulent system. Why do we want to invest there? And if you look at the foreign capital that's come to the United States in 2020, it's plummeted. I mean, it's just falls off a cliff. And as Paulson notes, he said that the Shanghai Index ranked first among global exchanges for number of IPOs and capital raised through the first 3 quarters of 2020. So I think we've talked before as well about, just the fact that the United States has, now over 300,000 deaths from COVID and clearly cannot manage its own public health crisis. That coupled with the fact that, let's say you're a foreign company and you just happen to be competing well against American companies, you're going to be attacked by the U.S. government. It's just not looking good for foreign capital coming to the United States. And we need it now, especially the fact that we're borrowing so much to manage the economic fallout from that. So I think just this whole move is just coupled with everything else that's going on in the world. It's just really silly.
I'm curious about what Biden is going to do. So this gets to kind of this comment that Biden made that I think is disastrous, honestly, for many of the lefties that kind of back Joe Biden on this. And I think this is kind of what you would expect. So it says, Biden says this. Biden says Biden says 7 senior Republicans have called him tonight. He spoke to, quote, one of the most senior members, unquote, who expressed a willingness to work on China and infrastructure. It's going to take 6 to 8 months, but the GOP will work with him. You're going to be surprised. What on earth are they going to work on considering China? I am so curious about that. Because I think we had the conversation last time about the deal that China pushed through, that many of these I think it's going to like 40% of the world's trade being sewed up. And this is in addition to the Belt and Road Initiative. So what on earth is Biden going to work with Republicans on? And I heard you mention that, and I heard you laugh when you said that, called it interesting. I don't think it's interesting at all. I think as we move on, that Democrats and Republicans have become very singular in their policy, especially foreign policy, and especially towards China. What do you think?
Well, I think everybody in the United States, I mean, not even just, the mainstream, but even, like I mentioned before, the populist wing of the right and the left are lockstep and unison against China. There was a bill that passed a week before that, before the S&P move, the S&P indices like delisted the Chinese companies, that it had a unanimous vote in the Congress that they were going to, have some kind of reprimands in place for publicly listed Chinese companies that don't follow certain audits by U.S. officials. And if you look at, let's look at one example of the new populist media, The Hill Rising with Cristobal and Sagar and Chetty. Both of those people, a populist right, quote unquote, and a populist left, Cristobal, both of them are always talking bad about China, or when Sagar goes on his rant against China, how it's China screwing American workers, Crystal just lets him go off the chain with that, It seems to me that there is this unified push. I mean, there's just so much United States propaganda against China. You'll see that every time the United States hits a new milestone low, for example, 300,000 deaths from COVID, or something happens, you notice that there's a corresponding amount of propaganda against China. We learned some new thing about some exploitative labor practice there, or some kind of, crackdown against democracy activists somewhere that most people have never heard of, but, we're just going to take people's word for it, the intelligence community and so on. When he talks about this interesting move, whenever the Democratic establishment and the Republican establishment work together to work on something interesting, especially when it has to do with a foreign country, it's always something aggressive. I think that's exactly what we're going to see. But I want to say that this is, they keep talking about building alliances against China to try to create some kind of, neo-Cold War alliance against China. But this is only happening in the United States. There was a Politico article recently that quoted the EU's top foreign policy chief saying that they were going to try to create a united front with the United States. And the bureau chief of the EU and for China Daily asked him straight up to his face, well, I guess via Zoom call, and said, is anything true about this from this Politico report? He said, no, it's not true. We depend on China. We're depending on China for our economic recovery. We need China's help to get through this. So I think this is really something coming out of Washington, and this is a flailing Washington that it's unable to actually cope with the reality that China is rising. And that's what I mentioned in my other article, I think, that you guys are going to mention next, about how we need to open up to China.
Let's do that. Yeah, I'm gonna bring that in right now. Coincidentally, you brought it up. I was about to bring that in too, because it's this asymmetry and historically the reliance, but also the continued reliance. Interesting conversation. Title of that article for folks listening, you can find it over on cgtn.com, is China opened up to the West. Now the West must open up to China, quote unquote. What you're talking about there, and of course this is public knowledge, is at least in part the history of Western manufacturing dependence on China. China is an industrial center, which it seems to me like at least over the past 30 years, arguably a bit more than that, we have heavily relied on them. And in that sense, the fact that we're complaining about their ascendancy at this point strikes a lot of people ironically. It seems a bit like an own goal. We, gave rise to them in some sense. We at least helped them to sort of get up from the kneeling position that historically colonialism had put them in. And now they're doing decently successful, massive population, what I'm going to call effective leadership. I disagree with a lot of its flanks, but historically, definitely effective leadership. How do you think we should open up to them? What do you think that process looks like? What do you think feasibly the governments of the United States and the government of China can work together on, and I guess the key word there being feasibly. What do you think is actually a sort of practical next step over the next decade or so, where you might see some signs of reopening up and a bit of a diplomatic armistice between the two countries, Brad?
So I think that the Chinese have really developed this idea of scientific socialism. I mean, this is something that's existed all the way. Well, I think the first reference to this I've ever seen was Friedrich Engels when he, in his book Socialism, Scientific and Utopian. They really developed this idea of socialism that's extremely scientific and not based on pure ideology, which I think was kind of a running current, at least in the beginning part of the 20th century. And they've experimented heavily with what works and what does not work. And I mentioned in that article that the Chinese Communist Party studies political movements around the world. In fact, they have representatives in I think every communist party in the world, every major communist party in the world, and then also ruling parties. And they were particularly interested in social democracy in Europe, which I think is quite interesting. They were interested in exactly how it was so successful and how it kind of addressed these contradictions in Europe between capitalism and socialism that existed at the time. They're a leadership that is very science oriented. I mean, so much so that it actually kind of frightens people. And if you look at the leadership of the Communist Party, there's just, a lot of experts, engineers, scientists, and so on that are in the party. I think our leadership needs to be more like this, because you look at the way that the right-wing ideologues, and when I say right-wing ideologues, I'm really referring to the entire American intellectual class, because they're very much right-wing. It's extraordinarily well documented in political science that the United States has one of the most far-right, Overton windows probably in the world. They are less concerned with actually developing policy than they are so much as creating PR campaigns or public opinion campaigns to try to sell people on old ideas. But the Chinese, and at least I should say, this current of socialism they represent, has almost a total monopoly on intellectual debate as far as how to develop the world politically, and especially to develop China politically. And I think that's really actually what the Chinese believe. They say it all the time. We're not going to convince people to be like us through the barrel of a gun. We're going to convince people to be like this because we're just better, because our system works. So how can we open up to that? I think, first of all, that's not going to happen because, of course, the United States, like Nancy Pelosi said, we're never going to be socialist. And I think they're very much wedded to that. They understand it would be against the interests of the donor class. But at least I think on these issues of like COVID-19, people are shutting their eyes in the West, pretending China didn't totally contain the virus. But that's ridiculous. In my opinion, it's completely ridiculous, because that is against everybody's interest. We should look at what China did and say, you know what, the next time this happens, because it's probably going to happen again. In fact, a lot of experts are saying it's probably going to happen again in this century, and maybe even sooner than that. we need to work with them and say, how did you do this? And really study it in depth. I think when we're looking at what's going on with the vaccine now, it's also ridiculous. The latest reports by the World Bank and other top organizations are saying that if we can coordinate the rollout of these vaccines, the global economy will actually grow faster than if we don't. It's just simply against everybody's interest not to cooperate, not to develop multilaterally, not to cooperate, for example, on science. And I think that's a real shame. If you look at the Cold War of the 20th century, imagine all the things that could have been accomplished if the West and East would have cooperated on science. And I think we need to make sure that doesn't happen and develop our technology alongside China, not try to, engage in a way where traditionally the West likes to keep its technology away from its adversaries or away from developing countries and create dependence. But we need to have interdependence, not just relations of dependence.
Broadly, you know what? I think we can agree with that. I'll agree with that last part particularly 100%. We can disagree on some of the ideological issues. We can disagree on the sort of left-right divide or what that means, what that entails for the political systems of the countries respectively. But 100% on, for one thing, combating the sort of modern definition of property rights as they apply to technology, as they apply to the patenting, not just of like entertainment property, but scientific intellectual property. There's a lot more to talk about there. Probably we'll have to come back to that in some form in this next segment. In any event, we have to go into a break. We're joined by Brad Blakenship, Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter. Check his columns out on RT and CGTN.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Bradley Blakenship, Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Bradley, we were having this conversation about basically opening arms to China. I guess that's kind of a way to put it, of the world basically working together, that China opened its doors to the West, and now it's the chance for the West to do the other, to basically turn the other cheek on that front. Is that even possible? Now, what I mean by that is we live in this kind of competitive capitalistic system, and I mean worldwide, and an advantage for one to some degree is a disadvantage for the other. There's always this gaming in the sense of advantage. And the last thing countries often want is to find themselves at disadvantages. And not to mention, when these countries are, let's say, rivals, you have this situation where there's inevitably conflict. So is it even possible for the United States or for, let's say, the Western countries to kind of open themselves to China in the way that you're talking about, when competition is basically the primary aspect of our geopolitical system?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's one, I would say, realist approach to this. And I think you're probably right that the United States is obviously not going to just open its door up to China and say, we're going to work with you, let's be allies, whatever. But I think another realistic approach to this that I personally adhere to, and I think is also well reflected within the opinion of the Chinese Communist Party, is that history goes one way. We all, presumably, I'm not sure about the Washington leadership, but I assume we all inhabit the same three-dimensional reality, and we all adhere to the forward motion of time. right? There's no way the direction of time and our technological pursuits and our advancement across society, generally speaking, always goes forward and not backwards. That's kind of like the law of motion of how our world works. The only difference is, it can be slow or it can be fast. And I think if we all learn to work together, it can be a faster thing that inevitably brings everybody forward. And that's exactly what the Chinese are trying to do, is through multilateral efforts, tackle these issues like climate change and tackle these issues like COVID-19, to help build infrastructure around the world to connect peoples and also, generally build the world's GDP together and create sustainable growth. I think that the way that Washington's handling the whole situation of a rising China I think it's really a reflection of the fact that the United States ideology, its constitution, everything about it is really rooted in really old concepts. I mean, if you even just look at our system of common law in the United States, it's based on it's almost like medieval English law. It comes from that. It's like pre-Enlightenment law. It's a law. It's a legal system that is before the civic code of continental Europe during the 1800s and 1900s. That was created to create some kind of like coherent law, and that's why even our legal system in the United States is fundamentally broken and has unequal outcomes all the time. It's generally political, but this is just one example. I mean to say that, some systems survive and some don't. That's just how things work. In the United States, if it wants to survive, it has to change with the times. And this is, I don't mean to say it's kind of like an inevitablest thing that the United States is going to collapse, but I mean to say that China is going to go forward with or without us. And it's just whether or not we want to join with that. I mean, if you look at their technology, they're developing technology that surpasses ours. The United States and the West traditionally operate in this world where they have a monopoly on access to technology, and that has been the case probably for hundreds of years. But now that that's not going to be the case, I think that will kind of accelerate this move where the United States is no longer the most powerful country in the world. And it just depends on, whether we want to do this gracefully or have just a brutal decoupling effort that hurts everybody. But it doesn't have to be that way. I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't know that it has to be that way either. I mean, coming back to the ideological difference here for a second, I'm going to push back on this very slightly. Just because we have a system that's predicated on older principles or convictions doesn't mean those principles or convictions are outdated. They might serve as some testament to, the fact that they can persist. And I wouldn't argue for them on those grounds. I wouldn't argue for something to continue simply because it's been around for a long time. You need to freshen up when it fits, when it suits. But legitimacy in some deep sense comes from history. It comes from like whatever foundation you have to build on. That foundation being deeper, wider, stronger, et cetera. And frankly, I think that's part of why China has succeeded, is that it has a history of statecraft that stretches back thousands of years beyond practically any other state in the world. I mean, as far as a continuous line goes, broken by revolutions, sure, it is, as far as I can tell, the oldest state in the world. And that, that's part of why it succeeded, albeit in a different form, in the 21st and the late 20th and early 21st centuries, definitely. And I do think that there's going to be some degree of imitation and rivalry. I'm just not sure how far that's going to, how deeply that's going to touch the foundations of America's political ideology. It would be like a graft from another blood type. That's a bit of a broken metaphor, but I don't think that we can do a complete porting, and I don't think we should try to do a complete porting ideologically. Thankfully, I don't think that's what you're arguing for. I think what you're saying is we should be looking at some of the broad strokes of how they responded, for instance, to the coronavirus, or how they've this actually gets into something interesting to talk about here. Not just the pandemic, but economically, the sort of regional experimentation and variation in recent Chinese economic history. That seems like it would fit the sort of the United States focus on statehood. You know what I'm talking about, where basically in the West, we have this conception of the Chinese government as being an entirely executive, top-down controlled lever from top to bottom, where the executive can control what's happening on the bottom level. As far as I can tell, over the past 40 or 50 years, they've actually permitted and encouraged a bunch more economic and policy experimentation on a regional level than we would have thought. Can you get into that for just a second? That's just interesting to look at. We've got about 5 minutes left.
There's kind of been a misconception across all of the major socialist economies from the Soviet Union to China. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, actually one of the major challenges that the modern Russian Federation had to deal with is the fact that they had almost no state institutions left over from the Soviet Union. For example, daycares, hospitals, all this stuff were built by the local companies that exist in the Soviet Union. So they didn't even have like a modern or a national healthcare system or national school system, because all of this was extremely localized. And it's always been the same way in China. And you're right that they have done some experimentations. In fact, the Chinese under Mao Zedong had tried to make that leap even to communism. They had started to build communes in some parts of China at various points. So there always has been an element of experimentation through the history of socialism. That's exactly what I was talking about before, about how I think that the socialists in the world have a monopoly on progress. They have a monopoly on good ideas because it's a fundamentally scientific approach to statecraft. The United States, I think, had pioneered in some way when they created their constitution, had created this kind of federal system that granted a lot of wide-ranging authority to local people. And this is also based in the notion of English common law that we took over. But we're seeing, I think, the limits of that, and even just the fundamental idea that there are people like me, there are people like you guys and other people that have this perception that things aren't working are proof enough that the system is becoming illegitimate, because, of course, our ideas and our thoughts and our disagreements don't come from nowhere. They come from our material reality that we experience. And so there's just this growing wave of people that are catching on to that. And I think that shows that it's just not working.
From the standpoint of our system, because I think I agree with you. I don't think it works. I think there's problems that are associated with it. And I do agree with you that a sane, rational society tries to take the things that are beneficial or take the things that will make us stronger and kind of, move on from there. Hopefully, ideally, becoming somewhat of a stronger system at the point where you leave it. Do you think there's any chance of that happening? I mean, like Shane kind of mentioned the various states and the sandboxes. I think there's supposed to be sandboxes, but the problem is they're basically the same. I mean, it's a capitalistic structure that has basically a few laws around the edges. Not to mention all of them have to balance their budgets, so there are severe limits in regards to that level of variosity or variability in regards to the states. I mean, do you have any belief, or is there any mechanism that you believe that would be able to kind of take on those positive traits that you consider to be from the Chinese government? And by the way, what do you consider a positive attribute for us to appropriate that you think will help us as we move on?
Well, I think the most positive attribute is just the ability to adapt to changing conditions and be able to, think on your feet. And I don't think we're able to do that. I mean, we don't even have a very large ability to debate in the United States. Our Overton window is so tiny. And they're like, for example, why is it that somebody like me, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm not as intelligent as I like to think that I am, but why is it that I have to have a column, for example, in China, or why can't I write for the New York Times, for example? Because it's just simply because my ideas are not popular in the United States. We cannot have honest discussions about the nature of our country, the nature of other countries. We simply are very closed. Exactly one of the problems that has existed everywhere. We talked, for example, about Belarus and this program. And one of the problems of Belarus, they have no political opposition space for their opposition. So people have to go outside of the political sphere. And that's what's happening all over the United States. That's
Bradley,
why we have independent media.
I 1,000% agree with you, man. And I really appreciate you coming on. I always enjoy when you come on. I always enjoy these conversations. Bradley Blakenship is a broad-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. You can follow Bradley on Twitter at BradBlink with a underscore, and find his writings on RT.com and CGTN.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, the United States COVID death total passed 300,000 yesterday, with at least 1,678 new COVID cases and 201,073 new cases that were reported in the United States on December 14th. Over the past week, there have been an average of 209,600 cases per day, an increase of 31% from the average just 2 weeks earlier. Fresh data reveal that more than 1/4 of Americans say they probably or definitely would not take the coronavirus vaccine. That is according to a survey released on Tuesday by the Kaiser Family Foundation, which found that Republican, rural, and Black Americans are among the most hesitant to be vaccinated. The skepticism, while not totally unanticipated, still represents a challenge as the country tries to tamp down on exploding infections, hospitalizations, and death. On the same day as the first inoculations were administered, the United States passed 300,000 deaths, more than any other country. Entertainment sector employees in Paris have gathered to protest coronavirus restrictions imposed by France. Cultural venues were expected to reopen on Monday, but new measures have taken effect, advising the entertainment sector to remain closed until early January. Sweden, the country that took a while to shut down, has seen excess mortality of 10% due to COVID, with 8,088 deaths in November. It is the highest number of deaths measured in the month of November since the Spanish flu in 1918. You know, it's funny. We have all of these people who come on the show, and we bring them on. I mean, you know, I disagree with them, but we bring them on nonetheless, and they talk about their ideology and how basically their ideology should override reality. This is a great example. Sweden ideologically decided they didn't want to close down. And we would have people come on celebrating Sweden. Look how great they are. Sweden is great. And even when Sweden turned around and said, okay, we failed, and basically repudiated the previous strategy, you still had people coming on saying that, you know, well, they didn't really repudiate. They didn't go that far. They didn't do this. Or people were arguing against masks. It's astonishing. 300,000 people have died. And I would imagine at no point do those people come to account dealing with the ideological outcome or the outcomes of their ideology as opposed to having to deal with the real world phenomena of a virus. Shane, what do you think? I mean, you would probably disagree with this, but I do think there's something to be said for reality as opposed to how people feel about that stuff. What do you think?
Well, for some people, and I know that, I don't mean to get too personal, but I know that in your own way you would agree with this. Having freedom might be more important. Having freedom for a part of your life might be more important than having a longer life. In the same sense, I mean, you're talking ideologically. Like, I can quote from, you know, this is a uniquely American perspective. You can quote Patrick Henry with the whole "give me liberty or give me death" thing. You can quote Benjamin Franklin: "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." The second one particularly seems to apply here. There are people who would rather have a shorter lifespan, but be able to use that lifespan however they please, even if it's doing stupid stuff, than to be forced to do some things in order to protect their own hygiene or public hygiene, for that matter. Now, is that right? This gets to the question of deeper ethics, or the, you know, meta ethics, the foundations of ideologies. That's its own conversation. But from within an ideology, I don't think it's that people are ignoring reality. Sure, in some cases they might be, but it's not necessarily that. It could just be that they prefer, you know, I don't want to live in a country that's going to mandate that I wear these things, even if it means that I might die a little bit sooner, or frankly, that the people I love might die a little bit sooner. Is that right? That's another conversation, but it's not necessarily that people are ignoring the facts or that they're ignoring what's actually important. They might just have different definitions of what's important.
Let the weak die off. Let the weak die off. I mean, yeah, that's basically what it is.
That's a misattribution. I think that's a misattribution.
I don't think it is.
I'll let you make your point. I don't
think it is. I mean, you basically said they care about things other than life. And they care about things, not just their life, but other people's lives. And you used the example of a mask. So I'll go with a mask. You didn't even use a vaccine. Vaccine would have been a stronger thing on this. No, if somebody makes the choice that says my life matters less than them putting on a mask, I'm going to think some way about them. And, if you say this issue of right or wrong, no, I don't think it's an issue of right or wrong. Right or wrong is usually on a goalpost. From the standpoint of right or wrong, I do think it's right or wrong from the standpoint of people who care about life, who care about human beings, who have any notion of compassion or empathy. Yeah, I think from that goalpost, it's wrong. From the goalpost of being selfish, from the goalpost of being ideological, then yes, you can go with that argument. But the idea that wearing a mask and you're okay with killing somebody else because you don't want to wear a mask, I think is, to each his own. But yeah, I think it's wrong.
But you're assuming, okay, so you're making a couple of assumptions here. And again, I'm trying to play the devil's advocate because I like to play the empathy game where I try to imagine the sort of best possible beliefs that other people could have. Not because they necessarily have those beliefs, but because I think it sort of strengthens your sense of trust and humanity as such, to try to engage in that as an activity. What if the person that we're talking about is risking their own life? What if they themselves have an autoimmune disorder, but they, for instance, neither want to be forced to wear a mask, nor do they want to spend their last days living in a society where they can't see the friends of, they can't see the faces of their friends or their family, where they live in a society that feels completely anonymous, where they're either stuck in their own home or they're, when they go out in public, everybody is effectively hidden. I mean, again, I'm playing super devil advocate here, or at least trying to.
Look, I'm pro-suicide. I'm pro-suicide.
Oh man!
If somebody wants to kill themselves, it's their right to do so. I am not going to stand in that way. Honest to God, people, and I don't mean that sheepishly. I mean seriously. If somebody wants to off themselves, it's their right. Look, I'm a libertarian on this stuff. You guys think when I say I'm a lefty, you realize a libertarian used to be the left. It became this kind of right-wing stuff in the United States. No, if somebody wants to do that, fair enough. My issue is other people. If the Sturgis people wanted to get together, and all of them, no issue. My issue is they're going home. They're going to these other states. They're going to these other places. And just like the guy I met at 7-Eleven the other day, he was like, masks don't work and I don't see the point in them. Well, that guy, he's not doing that just for himself. I don't care if he offs himself. I care about the fact that he has family, that he's going out, that he's messing around, and that he's potentially going to get somebody else who's sick or killed. Like, my issue, Shane, is not the individual liberty. That's not it. My issue is how it affects other people.
In his case, though, it sounds like you're mispainting. Like, it doesn't sound like he's a guy who's like, I don't care. Everybody else deserves to die. I don't give a crap. He doesn't think that masks work. Now, I think he's wrong. I wear masks when I'm out shopping, when I'm out in public, unless I'm just going on a walk by myself or whatever, hanging out with my brother, riding bikes. I will wear a mask. So all that up front. Having said that, if he doesn't think that masks work, it's not that he's evil. It's that he's, in my opinion, misinformed. Now, are you going to blame him for that? Or are you going to blame the absolute collapse, in my opinion, the legitimate collapse of trust in the scientific and academic and medical establishment, particularly after they themselves, and I don't want to come back to beat this dead horse, after they themselves recommended that people not wear masks in the form of a white lie during the early stages of the spread of COVID? Like, are you going to blame him for that? Are you going to level all the moral weight on him, or should you also petition some for the establishment as such?
I don't think the guy's evil. I think he's wrong, but I don't think he's evil. I don't think many of the people who are out here are evil. Evil is a little something different. I've reserved that for my grandfather. Most people don't hit that. But wrong, yes, absolutely. If you want to say, do I want to level some of that at the establishment? Absolutely, 1,000%. Because ultimately, it was the establishment. You can make an argument that got Fauci to make that lie in the first place. Like, let's be clear. Let me ask you, do you believe that all things being equal, that if we had the inventory that we needed, that Fauci would have told people, and it's kind of weird, sheepish, roundabout way, maybe you shouldn't go wear a mask. Like, if we had this stuff, do you think he would have said, yeah, I don't think he would have either. Like, I really do believe this is one of those things where, look, it's an infrastructure thing, right? I mean, to some degree, part of it is we have a discrediting of our system. Part of it is that. So part of it is not.
Here's my point: is that that's the consequence of telling a lie, even if it's white, even if it's a quote unquote noble lie. You're telling a lie, and when people catch on that you're telling a lie, they're less liable to believe the other things that you say. And they could have foreseen that, especially if they knew, as they could have forecasted out. Okay, so right now we're going to recommend that people not wear masks. And then in a couple of months, when our stocks are a bit higher, we're going to tell them, okay, now you should wear masks. And they're not going to be able to make sense of that. But that's our calculus. I don't see how that calculus makes sense. If they're not aware that the public is going to trust them less, they don't deserve the positions they're in.
You don't see how
their whole role in some sense.
Wait.
Their whole.
You don't see why they would do that. You just said you saw why they would do that.
Of course I do, but here's the thing: what are they responsible for? Public health. Now, how are they going to execute on making the public healthier? By having a relationship with the public. And if they abuse that relationship, if they tell a lie, even if it's a noble lie, I consider that an abuse of that relationship. I consider that them cutting away at their own foundation, chipping away at the concrete in their foundation so they can repurpose that for their roof or their walls or whatever. It's like they're loosening their footing. They're making it harder for the public to trust them. And public trust in them is the very basis of their ability to act. That's my main claim there.
Fauci had like a 60 or 70% trust. Just telling you. So I don't know what this lack of trust that you're talking about. This guy, yes. The random guy. And again, this gets away from the major.
I haven't seen that, Bull.
What are you talking about? Go look up Fauci's trust rate right now. Call the producers. Let the producer do it. I'm telling you, the scientists in this case are rated like 67%. Trump was like 30 or something to that effect. I'm making the difference that there's still a massive trust in science. That's the first part. On the second part to that random guy is not the original point that we had. The original point that we were making about whether or not an individual or people who basically say they prize quote unquote liberty, and they were okay with other people dying because they didn't want to wear a mask, that is... But
that's not what you said.
Shane, that was the argument that you made originally. It came to this guy because I brought up the guy in 7-Eleven, and then all of a sudden everything switched over to that. I'm talking about the main premise and the main point.
Go
ahead. Okay, what do you want to say?
What's your argument? In my devil's advocate, I never said that. You're putting words in my mouth. I was making another argument.
I don't want to put words into mine.
But it's a straw man. I
don't want to put words
into
your mouth. So make your argument. Make your very specific argument. Because I listened to you, and you basically talked about that guy. And did I think the guy was evil? I told you, no, I didn't think the guy was evil. I thought the guy was wrong, etc. And then you brought up Fauci again. And that Fauci was losing credibility in the scientific foundation, despite the fact that you understood the realism of it, that Fauci basically told people that because he didn't necessarily have the inventory. You understand. You want to be empathetic. But you don't understand, and explain your case. Explain your case.
I made about like 3 different cases here because not only has the topic changed as we've had this conversation, we've been talking about it from different perspectives, but I've tried to sort of list out different views that people have had. But what you haven't done here, Jamarl, is paint any specific picture of a person who said what your main claim is, what your main sort of inflammatory claim is, which is, a person who don't want to wear a mask, think that other people should die.
What are you talking about? We've had people on the show that made that argument. And my original premise was people on the show. Go back and look at the video. My original premise was we've had people on this show, all sorts of people who had certain beliefs that the whole idea of masks and even about wearing masks and that they were okay with people dying in lieu of wearing those masks.
But who? Which people?
Tom Luongo has even made that argument. The other gentleman, Mark Frost, who I even like, has made that argument that he doesn't believe that people should wear masks.
I don't think either of them have made those arguments. I mean, I might be misremembering, but I don't think so. That doesn't sound like the kind of thing they would say.
That doesn't sound like the thing that would say that they would basically say they would prefer people not to wear masks and they believe in freedom and they don't want the people to lock down and raise
what sounds plausible to me is that, particularly with Mark, because I believe he does wear masks. I think what he said is that he doesn't think that people should be forced to wear masks. And he would rather he live in a society where people are not forced to wear masks than in a society where they are forced and some people's lives are saved. You think? My guess, I don't want to, read too much into him or put words in his mouth.
Let the weak die off. And I have a hard time seeing how that is different from let the weak die off. That was my original premise.
Okay. But that's not what he said. That's the thing. If you're going from A to C, you're skipping over what B is. I don't know what the B is in that case. Those aren't the same things.
Okay.
I don't know
how
running
those
up
things
against
are
the end of the
materially
segment.
different.
We should come back to it.
Yeah, I don't know how those things are materially different. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. We did not get the opportunity for headlines today because we basically had a back and forth argument. Yeah, I don't think the Fauci thing is ever going to go away. That's going to be in 5 years. That's going to be the same argument. So let's end this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory, or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number to call if you want to call our phone number. Also, you get another way to say it, 202-521-1320. Our phone lines are open. That means you could be on them pretty soon if you'd like to. Jamarl, long and interesting back and forth. The back and forth that will never end. Fauci will, at least the controversy over Fauci will never die, apparently.
Yeah,
but it's good
because you're not going to let it die. I got to be honest. I got to be honest. Like, it just seems ridiculous to me. And maybe that's just my point of view of it. I mean, there is a realism.
We should bring up another one.
There's a realism about the world. There's a realism about the world where people are stuck with reality. And if you are in a position, God knows, I hope you are never in a position where you are stuck between two sides that are where you can't make the difference or you can't make a beat. And whether or not you're going to take the ideological position that honesty is the greatest thing in all situations, which I don't believe it is, versus...
That's not what I said either.
I know that's not what you said, Shane, but you need to make an argument to me to why and how Fauci can go out and advocate something that he doesn't have the capacity to deliver on. Meaning, he goes out and tells people to use masks and to get masks. And maybe even it's honest with them. Look, guys, we don't have a huge amount. We have a shortage. And people go and buy those masks up because they are terrified. And then the community of people like nurses and people who I go see no longer have enough supply. Now, yes, he was honest.
I said like 3 times or something what I thought he should have done, which is it wouldn't have been to say flat out, hey, everybody, mask work, go and buy some, or to tell the white lie that he did. What I said at the time, I guess shortly after, which is when we were talking about it, is what he should have said, hey, everybody, masks work, but you should not buy them. You know, we strongly recommend as an act of heroism that instead of going out to buy masks, you either buy them and donate them to your local medical institution, or even better, let them sit on the shelves, let doctors and nurses and people who need them while their own lives are on the line buy them. You know, this is an act of public spirit. I have faith in you, and do that. And then what the government should have done is simultaneously develop their own masks, purchase as many masks as they can from overseas, and purchase those masks off the shelves and distribute them effectively to medical professionals who needed them. And if they had done that, they would have had about just as many masks as they do now, and they would have saved the tens of percents of people who lost trust in those medical institutions because they bungled the situation, because they lied as they did.
Why do you
if they had done that, I'm pretty... because the government, if it had been effective at doing what it was supposed to do, would have done the exact same thing as it did. It would have bought those masks up. It would have purchased them. It would have requisitioned them.
Why do you think that the public...
Before the fact and after the effect.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, why do you think the public would faced with something they consider to be serious, not buy up the mask. I guess I don't understand why you think the public wouldn't buy it up just because Fauci told people not to do it.
Well, there are a couple of reasons here. For one thing, because the government would have already bought them. And for another thing, I mean, here's the thing, man. The public already did buy up a lot of the masks. I remember back in the early stages, a lot of folks were buying up the P95s or buying up the surgical masks. They're buying whatever they could get their hands on, despite what Fauci was saying, because they didn't believe him. Because they didn't believe him and the World Health Organization and Robert Redfield, et cetera, when they were saying that masks don't work. Because if you were looking at it, at the science, you kind of knew how the virus was spread. At first, it seemed like it was through surfaces. And then pretty quickly, a lot of folks were saying it was through air. It was through air transmission. So folks just didn't listen to him in the first place. They saw what was going on while it was happening. But they nevertheless lost trust in the institutions that were supposed to guide them through this crisis. So for one thing, they already kind of did. He had already broken that trust. It had already been breached. I mean, I could keep making my point here, but we've got a caller.
I don't know if you're making a point, Shane. I think, in fact, you're making the opposite point. You're basically saying that Fauci should have came out and told people, hey, masks work, but don't use them, and then buy up the mask. But you're basically saying that people already bought up the mask. So people were going to buy those masks regardless. I guess what I'm saying is I don't see how Fauci telling people that masks work. And those people, okay, yeah, let's go to callers. Because I don't understand the argument, if I'm being honest. I mean, if you agree with me that people were going to buy up the mask, not just agree with me, you said they bought them up anyway. And I suspect there probably would have been that much more if these guys would have came out and gave this kind of full-throated endorsement for masks. I think it hurts or it had a negative impact on other people and supplies. And I showed you that negative impact when I actually read. I mean, this was a list that I've read showing all of these shortages that the medical community had for masks. You're right. Let's go to the callers because I don't think this is going to resolve. We have our favorite caller, Louise from Virginia. What's happening, Louise?
Jamarl, and you're my favorite radio person too, along with Garland Nixon and Shane. So 3 favorite people. Thanks. I have 2 quick questions. 1, trust. Can we trust the Swedish government? Look how they caved in on Julian Assange. That was incredible. And 2, could someone please explain the Overton window to simple-minded people like myself who don't quite get it?
Oh,
okay, thanks.
That's simple-minded. Come on, don't do that, Louise. I hate when people do that. Overton window is just this notion of where the public is. Like the public, for example, the public might say 80% buy Medicare for all. Well, that wasn't that way during Obama's period. You might have had 40% or 30%. It's just the shift in the public's perspective and appropriation of ideas.
Another side of it, I would say, I just want to add in another side of it would be like what views are sort of permitted or permissible or seen as respectable. What views, for instance, if you're watching a debate on TV, you know, the span of the things that they talk about, the span of the things that they don't talk about, that sort of defines it. If they're talking about it, if you see it talked about on TV, if you hear it talked about on radio for the most part, that means it's within the Overton window. If you don't, in a given area or culture, that means it's outside of the Overton window. And then usually you find out what's not in the Overton window by listening to sources outside of that window, you know, by people from other nations or from other cultures or other times talking about things. And it's sort of like what is available for polite conversation within that society. That's sort of one way of putting it. Jamarl, how's that sound to you?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Oh, also Sweden. I don't think the issue is whether people trust or not trust Sweden. It's more so that Sweden was, like when I was younger, I've always wanted to go to Amsterdam. It was like the stoner's paradise, right? Sweden was like the paradise for people who didn't buy masks or didn't want to, do the lockdown stuff. It's not so much that people trust them or not trust them. It was just the thing that people were using as, resistance. That's the only reason I use Sweden. I do think it's illustrative that they pull back, especially with the number of deaths. I just don't think they had a choice. But Louise, does that explain? I don't know if she's still here.
She's out.
Oh, okay. Malik.
She is out. We have another caller. Yes.
And
we're still taking calls, by the way.
I think that's Malik.
202-521-1320. It is Malik. It is. We went back and forth on this a couple of times. I mispronounced it the first couple of times, admittedly because of how it was spelled.
Yes,
there's like a couple of chains of communication here.
Yeah,
anyway, 202-521-1320.
I appreciate
Malik,
you taking the time with my name there, Shane. Well, one of the things I wanted to chime in as I have in the past on this subject, but I come in peace. On Fauci, I wanted to say that a lot of people are not really familiar with who Fauci is. Fauci kind of came into at least this generation of Americans' consciousness based on the coronavirus. But many of us remember Fauci from the AIDS epidemic. My adoptive brother, died of AIDS. But before he died of AIDS, I was attempting to do a great deal of research to assist him with natural therapies that could build his immune system. And so I got to find out about Fauci. So, and many people in the AIDS and HIV activist community are very familiar with Fauci because Fauci was very famous for pushing AZT that killed a lot of people because AZT was highly toxic. And Fauci goes back that far, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. But I did want to touch in on the mask thing. Jamal, I personally wear a mask and I wear the mask. I comply because I have to. A couple of the jobs that I do require it. I don't. Do I think that it in all cases that it actually serves the purpose that's being promoted? No, I don't actually believe that. I don't believe that people should have to cover their noses and that everything that comes out of your nose is toxic. I'm not going to believe that. But that's me. But also as a member, as someone who belongs to the activist and organizing community and belongs to a liberation movement, I can't do the job that I do locked down in my home. I'm not a media influencer. I'm not a college campus activist. I belong to a liberation movement. And if I'm locked down in my home and I don't have the right to speak, and I don't have the right of movement, I can't do that job. I can't serve Black people in the capacity that I have to serve them because I'm locked down in my home. No one can do that. I mean, the job that you do, you get to sit at home and do it. The job that I do as a revolutionary, I can't do from my home, my brother. And so that's my piece on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Look, with the number of African Americans that have been dying from this, you can be at home, at least for a period of time. I think they'll be okay with it. That sounds blunt, but I'm sorry. I've lost quarter for this level of I can't be a revolutionary during COVID. Yes, I mean, I understand that. There's a lot of people who can't do what they typically do under normal circumstances. I don't like being locked in the house. I know a lot of people don't be locked in the house. I don't like that the government has done this nonsense of locking people in their homes and then not supporting them while they're in their homes. I don't like any of that stuff. By the same token, I didn't create this. This is one of those things where you yell at God about. This is not one of those things that you yell at human beings for trying to resolve it, or at the very least, mitigate the damage from it. You are literally living in a country where 300,000 Americans have dropped dead. The last week, 3,100 on one day dropped dead. So I'm sorry you can't be a revolutionary today. Give it a few months. You'll be back up there. Shane.
For real quick, I actually want to come back to this. You're talking about Fauci and the AIDS crisis. Watch Dallas Buyers Club. You ever seen that, Jamarl? Watched that recently.
No, I haven't seen that one. Wait, no, I haven't seen that one. Oh, by the way, Fauci. Look, I'm not saying Fauci is a god. I'm not saying he's, I'm not saying Fauci is wrong. Well, but go ahead, say it. I'm sorry. Make your point. I'm sorry.
No, and I don't really even care about Fauci in particular. As far as I could tell, the whole medical establishment sort of agreed that was the line of approach. Around the world. From the World Health Organization down to scientists and doctors and administrators in the U.S. So there's no reason to single that dude out. He is the sort of, not the shibboleth, he's the focal point for people's attention and ire when it comes to that specific issue. And I don't really mean to make him that. I mean, admittedly, he was, head of the White House coronavirus task force. And so he's the dude. He's the point man in some sense, but he's not the only point man. And anyway, Dallas Buyers Club, interesting movie starring Matthew McConaughey, a couple others. Jared Leto, I think it was, about a dude in Dallas who got AIDS and then was like in charge of like a sort of medicine smuggling ring. Just an interesting movie. Just pitching that to folks. Talked about AZT. Watched that with my brother within the past month or so. AZT immensely profitable, but arguably hurt a lot of the people who took it, and just a sort of a pharmaceutical industry product.
Real quick,
anyway,
what was the normal treatment for that? Was
Cole.
AZT the typical treatment that they were using for that? Like, I don't know the normal treatment that they were using.
From my limited.
Okay.
And this is admittedly going off of recent memory watching a nonfiction movie. So I'm not going to say that this is like the end all be all of research or that I'm an expert on this stuff. But yes, that was the first line of treatment. Doctors in hospitals would recommend that. And we're sort of suppressing, as far as I can tell, other potential treatments, which is why you had up sort of independent black market rings of people seeking alternative treatment in various cities around the world. You know, during a crazy medical crisis like we're dealing with now in some ways. Anyway, we've got to go into a break, folks. Hitting up against that. In fact, we pushed over our break limit. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break.
Noli.
Fault Lines.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Noli.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are working to bring our next guest on. In the meanwhile, though, I'm going to pivot slightly. This is actually what I wanted to talk about last segment before we got caught up in that very interesting continuation of the conversation from the segment before. It's the Jimmy Dore Medicare thing. Are you down to talk more about that, or what do you think, Jamarl?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, for just a minute or two here. As far as I can tell, and I'm just going to try to lay out the case that I see being made, if you force the squad to force Pelosi to put this vote forward, it's almost certainly not going to pass the House. But if either the squad doesn't do it or Pelosi doesn't do it, or for that matter, the House doesn't do it, which is a certainty at this point, as far as I can tell, then what you're going to get from that is people seeing, well, these politicians don't represent our interests, and ideally that drives some political change in the next election cycle, or the period preceding it. Is that broadly the case you hear being made? Does that seem to be the point?
I mean, it seems like, okay, so it seems like from the Dore side of it, it's basically action. Now, I got to be honest, I don't know how much Dore's thought into this, but I get this kind of emotional thing for ACT. And I also think they're positives, right? I do think there's a benefit in getting people in the mindset of you need to push your political people, just in general. It's something that should be done, and it's something that should have been done before the election. It's something you need to get in the habit of doing. You should push your political people. There's also something to be said about putting people on the record, meaning you have a lot of people who are basically signing on to Medicare for all for the optics of it all and saying, yeah, sure. But what does it look like when you're actually on the record for it? And is that something that a bunch of lefties, if you full well believe that the majority of the public wants a Medicare for all, well, you got them on the record. By the same token, who's running against Pelosi? And if nobody is really running against Pelosi, are you really going to ask, like, Democrats aren't going to vote in a Republican as Speaker of the House? I don't see that happening. So, like, it becomes this thing of, does it really have bang for the buck? Is it really going to do what you think it's going to do? And vice versa, you know what I mean? So it's not a perfect idea, even though there are benefits to the idea. And then there's this secondary question of what if they tell you to kick rocks? Then what? Like, are you going to go through with it? Like, all of that stuff has to be taken into account. I think the issue for me, though, is it seems that all of this is being dumped on AOC, which I think is absurd. Like, Joe Biden has just gotten in office. Joe Biden is president of the United States with the ability to use executive order. 1/3 of GoFundMe accounts are basically trying to pay for healthcare bills and medical costs. And for Joe Biden to come in office with a Democratic House and potentially even a Democratic Senate, depending upon how these two elections go, and to basically send prayers, I think it's appalling. And if that means that the person who's telling people to send prayers should be challenged for the Speaker of the House position, I think there's I think there's a there to doing so. Well, what do you think? I mean, because I do think there are weaknesses in it. And I do think it's not a perfect plan. And I do think it's somewhat unfair, in part to the way all of this is being dumped on AOC, as opposed to the 100 of people in the Progressive Caucus that apparently can't be bothered to actually be progressive. What do you think? Do you think I'm being fair in the way I think about this? Or do you think it's like, yeah, I think this is, foolhardy. I don't necessarily think this is going to work, or I don't necessarily think this is bang for the buck, or this is pointless. How do you see it? Because you're not really in the left. Like, you're not ensconced in the, the bickering and stuff that goes on that side. But just looking at it and the way I've tried to explain it, how do you see it?
No, thankfully I am not. No, I'm happy to. It gets a little bit lonely sometimes, but I'm happy to not really be a part of any political communities as such. And there is bickering. There's a lot of bickering on the left. I've got to say, looking at it from the outside in, like liberals and progressives and the sort of new left or rad libs, or I don't even know what terms are insults at this point, and what terms are terms of endearment.
About the trans bill that Tulsi Gabbard put out yet.
No, we have not.
We haven't even got there yet.
Yeah, Title IX protections stuff.
Yes.
No, there is some stuff. We should talk about that. We should get a guest on to talk about that, actually. Maybe a sports guest. That is the natural segue for that one, or the natural focal point for that one. Anyway, here's what I have a continued set of problems with this one. It seems like an L to me, and I don't see how taking an L for your political movement is actually politically motivating. What people want, people have plenty of evidence that their political system is corrupt and disengaged and complicit in larger problems in our society. That seems to be the atmosphere in the room in terms of the American party going on here. I don't see how pushing for something that seems good to some people and having that lose is going to motivate other people into either getting more politically involved or not voting, whatever the case may be. I'm going to put forward an alternative proposal. Probably other people have put this kind of thing forward before. What if you had like a minimum viable platform that it became popular to have as a person involved in politics, where it's like, I will not vote for someone, and I know that some people do this kind of thing already, but I will not vote for somebody unless this, and this condition is fulfilled, unless they support this policy, unless they have this in their docket, et cetera. And what if that became a sort of sine qua non for political engagement? This is, again, an admittedly off the wall idea in some ways. I don't know if it could take off. But if you make it a prerequisite that your politicians be able to do certain things, be committed to doing certain things, have it in their wheelhouse to do certain things. And only when those conditions are fulfilled, only when they have made those promises and you have reason to believe they would follow through on them, will you vote them into office. Like, if everybody did that in society, and if it became a socially desirable thing to withhold your vote from politicians until they fulfilled whatever those commitments were, if it became the norm that you voted based on what policies they were going to push instead of mere party allegiance, like if that became the norm, if there was some new political movement that had that as its plank. Do you see what I'm talking about this? Because I'm still thinking about it. And so, it's kind of loose and weird and shaky. Does that make sense? Have you seen people talking about that kind of thing? Again, from a mostly political outsider here, from an independent person. Jamarl,
yeah. So
have you seen that? What's your take?
We need to give that a really snappy slogan. Like, what can we call it? You get our vote when you represent our interests? Or maybe that's one of those things where you pick 2 or 3 policy proposals and you push like a tip of the spear.
What I was thinking was like minimum viable platform, because there's minimum viable product, and that's admittedly coming from like a tech background that probably is not going to fly with a lot of folks, but it's technically accurate. You know, what is your minimum viable platform?
There's three policies. I mean, that's what I guess that's what the whole thing of the tip of the spear thing. You get a vote when you represent interest, or the three policies like the Medicare for All, there's the student aid. Basically, pick three things that the American public loves and stands on the policy and push. It's the same idea. It's just saying, like, look, any politician that wants my vote, it needs this. You know, this is my minimum requirement. And I don't care who that person is. That person could be a Republican. That person could be an independent. That person could be anybody. This is my minimum requirement. No, I love that. I think that's how politics should be. And honestly, I think until it gets to that point, I think nothing changes. Because you basically have Democrats who vote for anything. Yeah, I mean, you have people who vote for anything. It's like, that person's a Democrat, blue no matter who, they get my vote. And it's like, you incentivize yourself being taken advantage of. As opposed to, if this is not on the docket, don't even come knocking. At the very least, there might be 20 or 30 million people who you don't get their votes for. But that's the catch. The people need to do it. This is a first mover problem thing that you talk about. Like, how do you get people to line up for that? Because that's how people should vote. That's how politics should be done. That's how leverage should be exerted. And I got to be honest, that's the basis of the AOC stuff. Like, when they're talking about the Nancy Pelosi stuff, basically what he's talking about is leverage. And I understand your point. It's like, dude, they're going to lose that vote. They will lose that vote. But the point is, you get people on the record. And the point is that you finally, for the first time in like 40 years, have gotten people to try to push and use leverage. Now, here's the catch. It doesn't have to be Medicare for all. And I think that's the problem. I think it's gotten so uber focused that it has to be Medicare for all, which I don't think it has to be specifically Medicare for all, because you're right, they're going to lose the vote on Medicare for all. And you might be able to get a vote that you actually win. And on top of the losing the vote for the Medicare for all stuff, I do think there's something to be said for getting people on the record as opposed to just having those people coast. I think a lot of focus has been put on AOC. I don't think entirely it's been fair, but at this point it's been like 40, 50 years and people want action. But no, Shane, I don't think that's crazy at all. I think that's the most sane, rational thing in the world for any political spectrum or for any political system, for people to vote for people who represent their interests. And they're representing it in the tune of 1, 2, or 3 policies, like you said. I agree. Pick a tip of the spear. I mean, for me, we're in a pandemic. How is it now healthcare? It just seems so natural to me. Like, when you find like one of 3 GoFund accounts are for healthcare, that's appalling. That's utterly appalling. No, I agree with you. 1,000% agree with you.
And I'm kind of reinventing the wheel here in some sense, because what I described there is actually just like a voting block, but maybe it's that voting blocks. See, it seems like they've degraded over time, where they're kind of moot, where people just vote based on party for the most part, and it's constantly set up in terms of simple dichotomies, meaningless.
No, but it shouldn't be.
Largely meaningless dichotomies that get recapitulated every 2 to 4 years.
No, it shouldn't be. Those voting blocks are a big deal. I mean, you're basically talking like a parliamentary system. Because my thing is, let's say if you're AOC, let's say you're members of the squad, you are not really the same as a Nancy Pelosi. You're not the same as a Joe Manchin. You know what I mean? Like, your political parties, if you were anywhere else in the world, would be different. Even Sanders is different. I mean, I'm saying this block is different. Well, the catch becomes this voting block just lumps in with the Democrats regardless of what happens. Now, what happens if they didn't just lump in? What happened if the 20 or 30 million people, let's say 90% of blacks, form a voting block? Let's say the lefties form a voting block. What would be in their best interest? And what would the Democratic Party have to do in order to get like 20, 30 million votes? Could the Democratic Party win without the black vote or without the progressive vote? You see what I mean? Like, the voting block thing is legit. Like, it's the argument, right? It's what should be done.
Okay. You know what? I have what I think is actually a better, or at least another idea. You know, ranked choice voting? Of course you do. What if you had a sort of inverted form of ranked choice voting, where if you were one of those people who didn't vote for one of the main political parties, you threw your lot in with either a third party or with no party by not voting? What if you had a sort of ranked choice list of the policies that you thought were most important? And what if that list were publicly accessible? the pollsters and different political operatives when they were looking at, okay, next election cycle, if we want to win, we really need to appeal to voters on these issues. And what if you made it like that is itself a form in some sense of political engagement. You are listing, I am choosing to abstain in this election cycle because these interests specifically in this order of importance are not represented. That means next election cycle and so on, iteratively, you get more and more information about why people are out of sync with the political system and what it would take to get them back in sync with the political system. That on its own is one small part of a process of political form, but I'm legitimately just trying to throw stuff up against the wall here, mainly because I see Jimmy Dore doing it. And I'm like, hey, guy, I can do some of my own version of that too. Anyway, that's more spaghetti on the wall stuff. We're going into a break here. We will be back on the other side of this break, and we are still taking your calls after struggling to get our next guest on. 202-521-1320 is the number, 202-521-1320. We will be back on the other side of this break, and you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. And our phone lines are open. That means we are taking calls from you. If you'd like, 202-521-1320 is the number, 202-521-1320. Here's the thing, man. If you get a bunch of people, this is another approach, broad approach. This is a sort of elitist approach to this problem. If you get a bunch of key people in the room and manage to convince them of something, either by hook or by crook, or, just by mere moral suasion, whatever, that rhetoric. If you get a bunch of key political players in the room, that's another way to solve these things. Now, whether you can actually convince them is another matter, because a lot of these fools are pretty stuck in their ways. But I think that you can, in some cases. I think that there is some room for that kind of thing. Does that? I mean, I'm talking in extremely abstract terms here, but does that make sense? I think that the smoke-filled rooms with the cigars and whatnot actually can be a viable path to political reform if you're coming to them with your own little power block, your own basis, and some key leverage there. What do you think, Jamarl?
I think the problem is that, look, I think the system is gamed. I think it's a certain degree of corporate capture. Even if you are able to see what policies are popular, I mean, I can tell you, Shane, I can look at the polling on it, right? I mean, it's very straightforward. It's not like Democrats and Republicans can't do a autopsy at the end. The reality of it is they don't want to know, nor do they want to attend to those things. For example, 72% expanded Social Security, and this is the American public. 69% Medicare for all. It's not even 69%. I think election night it was 74%. 67, 15 minimum wage. 67, legalized marijuana. 64, tax extreme wealth. 64, support unions. I guess I'm saying it's not that they're shocked by it, or it's not that they don't know. It's that they don't want to deal with it. Like their business model, the model to which they use to get elected, the model to which they have done politics for the last 40, 50 years, doesn't deal with this. I mean, when we went over Joe Biden and the people who Biden was putting into his administration, I mean, you basically had weapons contractors, you had, Facebook, Google, tech, you had these, it's like you're getting people who basically, people of policy. You get a clear idea of where Joe Biden's head is going to be based on the people that he's pulling into the administration. And that's not going to be on the left. The catch is, that's not because he doesn't know that those policies are popular. It's not that Biden doesn't know that if he pushed Medicare for all in the midst of a pandemic, that level of excitement would have brought all of these people to his side and he could have won the election in spades and maybe even take the Senate outright. He doesn't care because he knows the Republicans are not going to push for it. And so if you know you have a system where what the American public want is just off the table. The other party's not going to do it, so you don't have to do it. What's your hedge? You know that in the election that people are going to go vote. You know that even if it's a race to the bottom, even if you, like, basically you're fighting over smaller spoils to try to figure out and try to win. Under that model, you don't really need to try to get those people based on policy. You're just trying to get people based on the opponent. It's a scam. I mean, that's the way I see it. Like, you might try to look at the better angels of these guys' natures, but I'm not. I find it to be a scam. With callers, but I'll let you respond.
I go back and forth on that one, and I think it's broadly true, and I certainly think it's merited to act as if that's true. But if you sit in a room with somebody and they tell you otherwise, and they manage to convince you, then who am I to really? I don't know. That's more to, and that actually has not happened to me. I'm just holding out the hope that at some point I will be sitting with a politician one day, and they will manage to convince me that they're not evil and that they will work to solve some relevant problem in their district or whatever. But we'll see if that actually comes to pass. In any event, you're correct. We have callers calling in. 202-521-1320 is the relevant phone number for you to call if you wish to join this conversation. We have Anthony calling in from Detroit. Anthony, you're on the line. What's on your mind, man?
What's up, guys? Good morning. I just got to say, I am terribly disappointed and sad to hear you guys speaking so delusionally and expecting anything from our elected officials, particularly you, Jamarl. You're running the risk of losing your black card. I just got to say. But no, hopefully it's clear that that's being quite sarcastic. I totally agree, 100% with that. And I think, Jamarl, like the prescription that you guys are making, and Jamarl, I'm pretty sure you were quite adamant about that, in particular during the primary. But unfortunately, I don't think it's, I mean, call it a pessimistic outlook. I don't see the progressive fold ever, accepting that form of politics in America. I think we're constantly going to get this argument of, no, that's just not how it works here in America. We have to play by the rules. And I think one thing that kind of an underlying theme of that attitude and behavior, capitulation, is that the other important issues, such as the suppression of opposition that occurs within the Democratic Party, completely fall off the radar and are no longer even a part of progressive conversations anymore. I mean, obviously, Nico House, you guys, Jamarl, and the Convo Couch, you guys are more aware of the corrupt nature of our electoral system, but it's, we're not even pressing elected officials or progressive, that's not even anywhere near a mainstream conversation. So the real rot of the Democratic Party is never really truly exposed because of this capitulation is more or less the point I'm making. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, man.
Thank you for the call, Anthony.
Yeah. Well, I agree, right? I don't see him doing it. I mean, because I think at the end, every 4 years, you get this thing of you have nowhere else to go. And that seems to be the argument that's made. Progressives, lefties, 70%, they will complain, they will moan, they will cry, they will wring their hands, and yet 70%, it never fails. They will vote for the Democrat regardless. Shane, what you think, man? We have callers, but what you think?
Real quick, I mean, but didn't they show their hand back in 2016 with Bernie? For anybody who was watching, wasn't that as clear as
day,
sunlight in the day?
1,000%.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they do that sometimes, I guess. And I don't mean to be too critical of Jimmy Dore, because, again, I think this is better than the alternative, which is, like you were saying, Jamarl, to do nothing. I just wish there was something more productive than taking what's almost certainly going to be a loss here. And I'm pretty sure that there is. It's just a matter of having the creativity and the political will and, whatever else it would take to come up with something. I'm not even a part of the left, but but it's like, come on, guys.
It's like, do something. And anyway. I do get, like I said, I do get the flaws, right? And I don't even think it's entirely fair to hit AOC on this, because I feel like it's like for the last 40, 50 years, there's been a progressive caucus in Congress. It's like AOC gets in Congress and all of a sudden all of the heat goes to her. What about the other 100 members of that caucus? Like, how do you get 74% of the American public saying we want Medicare for all? How do you get 1 in 3 GoFundMes for healthcare? How do you get 200,000 people infected with the virus? 10 million, 12 million people infected overall, 300,000 dead. These numbers are astonishing. And then you have a Biden that just won, who has the ability to make an executive order to Medicare for everyone with COVID. You have Nancy Pelosi that could put that on the docket. They could use that for politics, but instead they say it's in prayers. Yeah, like something should be done. And I think that's the angst, right? Like you see her say it's in prayers and it bites you. Like it angers you. If you're one of those people that died or had a family member that died from COVID, that is angering, man. It really is.
It is. Let's go. Let's get more callers. Let's go to him. Stedman in Detroit. You're on the line. What's on your mind, man?
Hey, so I posted a link in the chat from the NYU Langone Health website. It links to a research study, but it says that when you adjust for income, health, like pre-existing health conditions, Black people actually have and they're hospitalized on time. Black people have a greater percentage of not needing hospice when it comes to COVID-19. So I think some of the information is kind of lost because we've gotten so many different opposing views about whether Blacks and Hispanics, actually is the article, are more or less susceptible to COVID-19. And I think the big issue, like what Jamarl is saying about, we should all wear masks, and like Malik, who was Malik saying that, he can't do his activism. And to a degree, I agree with that because it limits social civil unrest. But you see it being eased up in specific situations when the media or the establishment or elite would like that to be that way. Just like when Joe Biden won and they were sending out emails, they told us, hey, can you meet downtown? We're going to have a party to celebrate Joe Biden's election. Was anybody enforcing COVID-19 restrictions? But if I want to go out and protest because Black people are being mistreated or low-income people are being mistreated or there's no money coming to working families, people who have been out of their homes, I'm not allowed to do that. And to a greater degree, we have to look at, if the causes of Black death or suffering as a result of COVID-19 are a product of our environment and not something inherent to Black genetics, then we have to make a greater stand against the system. And so I wear my mask. My family, we wear our masks. I have 3 family members who have had COVID. 2 have had it twice, different ages. I had a family friend. Her aunt died of COVID. And so, my family has been fine. My family who has had it twice, they're fine. Their symptoms were worse. They were worse the first time, but they never needed to be hospitalized. It never felt like more than just a cold. And I'm not trying to say that, this is no big deal or whatever. I still wear my mask. They still wear their masks. So there are some, masks aren't 100%. There's some research to show that, masks can increase some of your exposure because you're touching your face or maybe you get a false sense of security or whatever. So, as Black people, we live in a country that is literally trying to kill us at every turn since we've been here. And so if we're going to limit our action or behavior to the fact that a disease can kill us without addressing the root causes of those problems, which is institutionalized racism through employment, through housing, through education, through access to medical care. And, what we're doing is we're going to sit in the mud and not do anything. And we're also not going to address the issues. Second thing I wanted to talk about was the Jimmy Dore progressive issue. So with AOC, I feel like a lot of the heat that she gets is because she wanted to portray herself as the leader of the progressives, not the leader of the progressive caucus, the leader of the one. She wanted to have a meeting, a protest in Nancy Pelosi's office. She wanted to have all this media attention where she's calling out the Democratic establishment, saying they're worthless, they're trash. And so now, when it's her turn to do something, she wants to say, well, we have to be tactful. Your whole transition to being a congressperson, the whole campaign you ran, wasn't about tact. It was about directly addressing the needs, the emotions of the people who wanted you to win. If we're going to get somebody in office who's going to support Nancy Pelosi the same as Joe Crowley, who's not going to fight for progressive policies, who's going to be more concerned with a political appointment or, a committee appointment, then we should have just kept Joe Crowley because at least then we knew who our enemy was. So by this vote, what happens is the people get to see that the people who signed on, the quote-unquote progressives who signed on for Medicare for All, who ran on Medicare for All, do not have their intentions in mind. They were lying.
I hear you, Stedman. Okay? We've got to close out this hour. We're hitting up against a hard break. Thank you for the call. More to talk about there. Same as it ever was with politicians going to Congress and changing their tune. But we'll talk about that more later at the end of the next hour. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in less than a minute with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news and events in those divided states, as well as across the face of our divided globe. And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And going into the headlines this morning, in the news, first up in COVID news, the United States COVID death toll passed 300,000 yesterday. That's with at least 1,678 new coronavirus deaths and 201,000 new cases reported. Over the past week, there has been an average of 209,600 cases per day. That's an increase of 31%, from the average 2 weeks earlier. Fresh data, meanwhile, revealed that more than 1/4 of Americans say they probably or definitely would not take a coronavirus vaccine. That is according to a survey released on Tuesday by the Kaiser Family Foundation, which found that Republican, rural, and Black Americans are among the most hesitant to be vaccinated. Skepticism, while not totally unanticipated, still represents a challenge as the country tries to tamp down exploding infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. This on the same day as the first inoculations were administered. United States passed 300,000 deaths, more than any other country. Again, so
right,
grim milestone, as well as another milestone, arguably a positive one, although, again, that remains that's subject to the opinions of the individual in this country. Entertainment sector employees in Paris have gathered to protest coronavirus restrictions imposed in France. Cultural venues were expected to reopen on Monday, but the new measures have taken effect, advising the entertainment sector to remain closed until early January. Meanwhile, Sweden, the country of Sweden, has seen excess mortality of 10% due to COVID this last year, with 8,088 deaths in November. That's the highest number of deaths measured in the month of November in Sweden since the Spanish flu in 1918. Back in general political news in the U.S., U.S. Attorney General William Barr is stepping down before Christmas, the president has announced. Mr. Barr's term was due to end on the 20th of January when Trump leaves office. Tensions, however, between the two flared after Mr. Barr said there was no evidence of widespread fraud in November's vote. He was criticized by Mr. Trump for not publicly disclosing during the election campaign that the Justice Department was investigating Joe Biden's son. Trump tweeted Barr's resignation letter saying, "Our relationship," and I quote here, "our relationship has been a very good one. He has done an outstanding job," end quote. This as an electoral college vote, this as the electoral college has formally confirmed Biden's victory, submitting all electoral college votes. And again, I would say this represents the last nail in the coffin of Trump's attempts to assert himself as president in 2021. Jamarl, what's your take? Do you think Trump has any chance at this point?
No, I thought Trump was toast pretty soon after the election. I mean, to me, again, this goes back to institutional support. It's very strange. It's worrying, and I don't think people should applaud, like thinking that, oh, we dodged a bullet and everything else. I think this stuff takes a certain momentum about itself. I don't necessarily think that stuff happens in one go. I think what it tells us, though, is you'll have, based on political pressure and what you probably can get across, a lot of people that are willing to go along with something that they may know is not necessarily true, but would do so out of political reasons. And that is terrifying. I think many of these people care more about their ideological or, let's say, tribal distinctions in regards to the party than they do about the country. And, for Democrats who say, yeah, that's right, you too. Russiagate was no different. Both of these things are just, different colors of the same cow or whatever. But that's my thought. I honestly think that these things are the same. They're just different colors of the same Kool-Aid of sorts. So yeah, Trump's toast at this point.
It's true.
Oh, by the way, he will contain power in the party. His power is not necessarily going to go anywhere just because he loses.
particularly if he creates like his own media company, as some people have been talking about for a while. I'm not sure where he's going to go. Obviously, he has businesses to go back to, but he might try to start another venture. That seems to be a Trumpian thing to do. And again, with a lot of people's on the right, distrust for Fox at an all-time high. I think there is room for another sort of more mainstream media venture. I'm not giving him advice, although hell, Trump, if you want to throw me money for saying that stuff, go right ahead. Anyway, Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday congratulated Joe Biden on winning the U.S. presidential election in November, saying he hoped the countries could set aside their differences to promote global security. Not sure that's going to happen, though, given these next couple headlines. Department of Homeland Security was successfully breached as part of a major attack on U.S. federal agencies by, I'm going to come back to this, suspected Russian hackers. That is according to Reuters, reporting this yesterday. Reuters cited, quote, people familiar with the matter, end quote, in reporting that hackers believed to be working for the Russian government had successfully gained access to internal communications within DHS. DHS spokesperson Alexei Volturnist did not directly confirm the breach, but told The Hill that, quote, the Department of Homeland Security is aware of reports of a breach, end quote, and, quote, are currently investigating the matter, end quote. The report comes the day after Reuters first reported that both the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration had also been breached as part of an attack backed by a foreign government. The Washington Post attributed the breach to a prolific Russian military hacking group known as, quote, unquote, Cozy Bear. Talked about this yesterday, talking about it again today, and I'm sure I'll be talking about it again in the weeks and months to come. As far as I can tell, there is no substantive basis other than high-level, anonymously sourced media reporting to assume that this is actually from Russian intelligence services, let alone that this is from a distinct group as such. What we call these advanced persistent threats are basically sets of malware and sets of activity that we've sort of lumped into a single threat group, a single group of people. But there is scant evidence, at least in the public domain, that I can tell, that, we know that these have come from any individual group, let alone that group is associated with the Russian government. So I could get into specifics. I want to get guests on soon to talk about this. But at least for now, that's a brief summary. Interested in talking about that. If anybody is curious to, you can call in pretty much any time, 202-521-1320, particularly during the end of the hour of today's show. Anyway, next headline here. The Trump administration issued sanctions against Turkey's military acquisitions agency on Monday to punish the NATO ally more than 3 years after it bought a missile defense system from Russia. The economic and travel penalties against Turkey's presidency of defense industries and 4 of its top officials were as much a warning to other nations, including India, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, that are considering buying arms and other military equipment from Moscow. A couple ahead, again, I sort of prefaced as part of the third to last headline that I was talking about with Putin congratulating Biden on his victory, saying he hoped the countries could set aside their differences to promote global security. I doubt that's going to happen in a Biden administration, simply because, our government, as far as I can tell, is largely run by the military-industrial complex, largely run by intelligence agencies. So much influence there exerted both directly behind the scenes and indirectly through all of these anonymously sourced leaks to the media that, just by the media's power, shifts public opinion, shifts political opinion, gradually moves Congress and the White House more and more in a militaristic direction. Anyway, Jamarl, last couple of headlines aside, and I've got more I want to get to in a minute here, but what's your take? Not just about where you think the Biden administration is going to go. Do you think there's any damn chance that we'll be able to cast off the shackles of the Millen complex anytime soon? No. I mean, I'm guessing that you think it's something we should be doing, but any chance?
No, not at all. I don't see. I mean, usually they're precursors if something is going to happen. I mean, right? I mean, oftentimes this stuff doesn't necessarily happen in one fell swoop. And I don't see it from Biden, who has a very specific ideology over the last 47 years he's been in Congress. Very hawkish, very militaristic. I mean, you can go back and look at the videos with him talking about Bush. If you can get rid of Saddam, he was on board for it. I mean, even prior. So, no, I don't see anything changing. I don't see Kamala Harris, if she becomes president, nor do I see who comes after her in the Democratic Party being something different. So, no, I don't see anything changing anytime soon, especially not in Biden's administration. If anything, it gets worse. I expect more wars. I expect more people being killed, especially from in comparison to Trump. That's grim, but I think it's true.
I could see it. And that's what I've been saying for months now, sadly, that Biden will probably be a bit more bellicose. You know, who the administration is bellicose towards might change a bit, might be a little bit less towards Venezuela, towards, more towards other countries, Iran, Russia, more engagements in the Middle East, that kind of thing. But by and large, if you're just using a simple number, it's probably going to be higher than what Trump was doing. Anyway, internationally, Australia's prime minister said Tuesday that China would be violating World Trade Organization rules and a bilateral free trade agreement if it banned Australian coal after China's state-owned newspaper said Beijing's main planning agency had given power plants approval to import coal without restrictions, except, that is, for Australian coal. French fishermen threatened to blockade channel ports if there is a no-deal Brexit. This is after the UK refused to agree to demands by France for EU vessels to be allowed the right to large fish quotas from British waters after the UK leaves on January 1st. In India, around 5,000 nursing staff from Delhi's All India Institute of Medical Sciences hospital declared an indefinite strike over salaries. And in Iran, Tehran intends to complete this next year in 2021 a strategic project to transport oil bypassing its key energy route. It's the Strait of Hormuz, due to the instability in the area. It's according to Iranian President Hassan Rouhani saying this yesterday. I wonder what that route will be. Probably by land, but we'll see. National Iranian Oil Company, NIOC, sent a crude tanker to Venezuela to load it with oil despite U.S. sanctions. China's 500-meter aperture spherical telescope, its acronym for which is FAST, is the world's largest radio telescope and has opened its doors to foreign astronomers to attract top talent from around the world. The news comes after the U.S.-owned Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico was destroyed after its 900-ton receiver platform broke and fell 140 meters into its radio dish this month, destroying the device. The UK telecommunication regulator Ofcom will have the power to make tech firms responsible for protecting people from harmful content such as violence, terrorism, suicide content, cyberbullying, and child abuse under a new bill to be presented to Parliament next year. It's the UK government announcing that today on Tuesday. And I'm curious what exactly that will mean. I'm just going to repeat this again. We'll have the power to make tech firms responsible for protecting people from harmful content such as violence, terrorism, suicide content, cyberbullying, and child abuse, end quote. A lot of that stuff sounds good. But then, of course, the concern is that what gets swept under the rug in one of those omnibus bills is really just one of the larger bills, blanket bills, is that you're going to suppress speech potentially. You're going to increase surveillance of certain kinds of communications that don't fall under those categories. I don't know. We'll see. Par for the course, admittedly. Last headline here, Zoox Inc., the self-driving startup owned by Amazon.com Inc., unveiled a fully autonomous electric vehicle with no steering wheel that can drive day and night on a single charge. The vehicle, which Zoox describes as a driverless carriage or robo-taxi, can carry as many as 4 passengers. With a motor at each end, it travels in either direction and maxes out at 75 miles per hour. 2 battery packs, one under each row of seats, generate enough juice for 16 hours of runtime before recharging, the company said. To commercialize the technology, Zoox plans to launch an app-based ride-hailing service in cities like San Francisco and Las Vegas. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Jamarl, I saw you. That last story came from you. What did you think about that? You were posting that in the chat a little while back.
I thought to myself, I was like, here it starts. And the thing is, it's already started. This car is being currently made, even though it's not necessarily out yet. But you have other companies that do have cars out that are being tested, like Phoenix, and apparently some other states. I think San Francisco is one of the other locations. We greatly need to understand what this means and what this is going to do to our world. Like, we're shocked with the changes that we have from COVID. I don't think we've seen anything yet. For all of my issues with Yang, he is right about this, where he's making this point about the society changing and what happens to all of these, like right now. And I know we have to go, but right now we have like Uber, we have Lyft, we have all of these drivers that take this stuff from point A to point B. Many of these people are doing this not because it pays well, but because it's the only thing that pays. And they're doing it because it's the last thing that makes ends meet, this kind of economy. What happens when those jobs go away? Those are going to go away. No, none of those people are going to be, like, all of those taxis, all of those Uber drivers, all of those things are going to be better to basically have automated systems. And when those automated systems come into play, when those things are solar powered or battery powered, and that thing rides around, you don't need a driver, you don't need anything, that money's just going to go to the top, and those people are going to lose their jobs. And so we need to be aware of this. This is one of those things where we need to be making changes for now, legally, meaning laws and everything else to plan for the fact that there's going to be a major shift in the way we do our technology and the way we do our employment, and a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. That's my thought. I mean, but let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment with Lucy Komisar.
Fault Lines.
Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Komisar. We are joined by Lucy Komisar for this segment and the next. She is an investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. And by the way, you should check her articles out at thekomisarscoop.com. It's spelled, by the way, it's Komisar. So Komisar with a K at the beginning, thekomisarscoop.com. Also follow her, Lucy Komisar, on Twitter. Lucy, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm fine. It's a pleasure to be talking to you again.
It's a pleasure to have you on to talk about this. I'm going to start with a sort of high level thing that I think is most important from a sort of general geopolitical perspective, which is the EU adopting sanctions rule. This is based in large part on an article from you over at thekomisarscoop.com titled European Union Adopts Sanctions Rule to Target Political Adversaries, quote unquote. In your article, you call this rule, basically, it would be creating a star court, effectively a kangaroo court, in which the verdict is assured from the point at which the charges are filed, which would basically allow political adversaries of states that use this in the European Union, that use this court, people to target their political adversaries for sanctions without any real process for determining whether or not that's actually merited, whether or not it has to do with real violations of human rights. First off, is that broadly accurate? What am I missing? And going a little bit deeper into it, what are the details of what's going on here, Lucy?
You have it exactly right. It's a star chamber, and they passed this December 7th, and they said, and it's to it would ban visas and freeze assets of individuals and entities, which could mean companies, could mean states, that the European Union Council of Foreign Ministers decides are guilty of crimes against humanity such as extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, or otherwise involved, meaning they make money off all of this. And the council would be acting on a proposal from a member state or from their own foreign affairs security policy official to establish this list. There's nothing about due process, which makes the council a star chamber, which is the name of such tribunals in the bad old days before liberal interventionist human rights groups decided that it was really okay to have a star chamber. Now, the question is, extrajudicial killings, does that include police murders in the US or the UK or France? Arbitrary arrest certainly would not be the persecution and detention of Julian Assange. Torture? How about the torture centers at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo? Now, otherwise involved, how about the Western banks that run the offshore accounts where some of these culprits stash their money? So we already know that this is fake. It's not really a human rights law, because a human rights law has to have due process. Another point is they began to talk. There was talk in the Parliament and around the Council of who would be targeted. The Russians, of course. No mention of China, because there's too much money at stake. And now, an interesting point here, a footnote, is that William Browder wanted this to be called a Magnitsky Act, also known as the William Browder Protection Act, which builds the Western Wall against the Russians, calling him to account for over $100 million in tax evasion and illicit stock buys of Gazprom. And he used his favorite tactic, which is intimidation. He threatened the Dutch foreign minister, Stef Blok, in 2018 for not supporting a Magnitsky Act. He said, and he has a tweet he put out, being against the Magnitsky Act is often a career-ruining proposition. Minister Blok should study what happened to former Canadian Foreign Minister Stéphane Dion for vociferously blocking Magnitsky Act in Canada. Well, guess who introduced this sanctions bill? It was the same Minister Blok, and it did not have Magnitsky's name, and he lobbied to make sure there would not be a Magnitsky name at the top of this. Browder's going around calling this Magnitsky Act or a Magnitsky-style act, but, he lies all the time. It has nothing to do with Magnitsky. So if you see that, you will realize that it's, a typical Browder lie. Now, and the other funny point is that the chief foreign affairs and security policy person for the EU, who's one of the people that can make a recommendation for who should be banned, is Josep Borrell. He's a former Spanish foreign minister. And before the proposal was voted on, he spoke at a European Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee. He said he'd never heard of Magnitsky or legislation named after him. Now, the other point that you have to consider, so we're really glad that Browder lost on this. One of his recent defeats. But the question is, what about the International Criminal Court? Isn't this a competition to the International Criminal Court, which, by the way, does have due process, and so therefore cannot be used as just an attack on a country that you don't like? But this is part of a movement toward weaponizing human rights. And the EU said in its own statement about this, sanctions have become part of the EU's external relations toolbox in the past 2 decades, with over 40 different restrictive measures in place against individuals in 34 countries. So the EU has weaponized human rights to target its international adversaries. And we can be sure that it's not going to name the true victims of human rights, such as Julian Assange. But it's a real problem that the liberal interventionists have weaponized human rights so that this human rights regime is a fake.
Well, I mean, right now, the ICC doesn't necessarily seem to deal with cases like, for example, I don't know how the ICC can stand there with the invasion of Iraq. Like, it just seems weird to me, right? Especially with the abuses that have come up. And even in the cases of Afghanistan, where the U.S. would actively attack the court. it does seem like some of these bodies around the world that are supposed to deal with human rights or human rights abuses are basically just used to attack other countries. So, from the standpoint of the ICC and how this will compare with the ICC, that is a very good question, and I think that would be very bizarre. Do you believe that basically this is going to be an organization that's used to attack Russia? I mean, that's basically, I think it sounds like.
Well, it's a measure adopted by the EU, so it's you could call it a regime, their human rights regime. Yes, it will be to attack Russia and any other enemies that they decide that are their enemies, and it will never be used to attack countries that are considered allies, and certainly not any of them could possibly be at the end of a complaint. So it's fake to begin with. And the point about the ICC is quite good. It's the existing human rights court, but nothing seems to go on there. There is an EU, the human rights court. And that also exists, and people can bring complaints to that. In fact, Browder brought a complaint about on the Magnitsky story, and they basically turned him down. They ruled a year ago that the arrest and detention of Magnitsky was quite legitimate based on the evidence that he was involved in tax evasion. So the European Court of Human Rights actually did a decent job. So that's an existing court, and they could use that court. So if they don't want to go to the ICC, which is, I guess, at the point you're making, it's really become moribund, they could use the existing European Court of Human Rights, which they don't do because what we see clearly is it's just another weapon. It's a political weapon against foreign enemies, and it's of itself a star chamber. Of itself, it's a denial of human rights to punish people without giving them any opportunity to have due process.
So, Lucy, one of the points that you make here is that they bring up Russia in the text setting forward the framework. They don't bring up China. Now that they're arguably presumably a monetary interest there, but a large part of what this framework allows for is the freezing of assets of the entities being sanctioned, individuals being sanctioned. It seems like in the long run, if you're setting this up as a precedent, and if it's being used as it already has been in the forms of the applications of the Magnitsky Act, that's going to affect asset flows. It's going to affect flows of capital potentially dramatically in the long run. I mean, just using the United States trade war with China, for instance, that changed the global dynamics of trade and investment and the natures of our various economies. If this framework is used more widely, it could, like you're saying, if there's little due process, it could be used willy-nilly to freeze the assets of pretty much any player who's quote-unquote complicit, who's alleged to be complicit in a regime that's violating human rights. How do you think that's going to affect the global shape of capital flows, of asset flows? What do you think that's going to do to the politics, to the diplomacy of these different nations? I'm kind of giving it, a broad question here. I don't mean to put too much on you, but just broadly, what do you think this is going to do in the future?
What's already happened is that the Russians are moving their money out of dollars, and they just announced that a new plane that they developed will now have a Russian-made engine instead of an American one or one from the West. So I think that the individuals and countries who believe that they could be targeted for political reasons will move their money and their assets out of reach, so that they cannot be attacked. Now, Switzerland has been one of the countries that people have put money in and thought it was safe, but not necessarily anymore. I think they're just going to move their money into places that are safe and their assets in places that are safe. And maybe they will also respond in kind, that if somebody or some country or entity is targeted, maybe in that country they will target an equivalent entity in the West, or whoever of the country perhaps who brought the complaint. So I think that we're going to have people and countries are not going to just sit back and say, okay, you froze our assets and our money, we're fine with that. They're not going to be fine with that. So supposedly what used to be the free trade regimen is now becoming an unfree trade regimen where it's a political weapon under the guise of human rights, but it really has not much to do with human rights when there's no process. And I think that. And
this is Lucy. We have to go into a break. This is one of the, I would say, along with the sort of resumption of the Cold War, a lukewarm war at this point between the United States and Russia. Not really, but we're continuously alleging practically every election cycle now that Russia has breached, has infiltrated, has hacked into our elections, whatever the case might be. Heck, the Treasury and Commerce departments yesterday, the DHS, claiming that Russian security services had hacked in. That came out right after an election. So we're definitely getting back into that. That aspect of the legal wake of William Browder, of the various Magnitsky Acts, and of this new framework that you're talking about, that along with the sanctions that we're talking about right now and the impact those sanctions will have, the freezing of assets on the ideology and the practice of, like you're talking about, global free trade, globalization as such. Very interesting part of this story. We're going to have to go into a break. We'll be back in just a minute with Lucy Komisar, investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Lucy Komisar. She is an investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. You should check her out, read her articles at the Komisar Scoop. That's Komisar with a K, thekomisarscoop.com. Also follow Lucy on Twitter at Lucy Komisar. Lucy, thank you again for being with us. I want to continue this conversation, but I want to turn to your other recent article. This is an update from Switzerland, which will be dropping Browder's charges against Russians. Can you just give us a background? This is a 9-year-old case. This has been going on for a long time. What's been the fallout? Maybe we can start after the announcement. What was Browder's response to Swiss authorities when they shut this case down, when they didn't give him what he wanted?
Oh, of course. He said they were caving into the Russians. This is another loss for Browder, which is a good thing. And it's been 9 years. He brought fake charges against some Russians that he accused of taking money from the $230 million tax refund fraud, which we now know he was complicit in. And this was a fraud on the Russian treasury based on collusive lawsuits. Some crooks used shell companies to sue other shell companies and said, you cheated us, you owe us a lot of money. And the companies that are sued say, of course, you're right, we will pay. So Browder's companies paid, and it turned out to be $1 billion. Of course, they immediately paid. We don't know if they ever paid because we don't have any track of where money may have gone. Then they demanded a tax refund because they had lost all their profits for the previous year. And that turned out to be $230 million, everything they had paid. What a coincidence. But he Browder ran around accusing others of this tax refund fraud. And there were some Russians with Swiss accounts, and that's how we get to Switzerland. He provided them documents. How did he get the documents? Well, there was a guy named Alexander Perepelichny, and he had been handling investments for a Russian named Vladimir Stepanov, and he was the ex-husband of a woman who headed a Russian tax office. He lost a lot of money. He was investing for his client, who was very angry, and Perepelichny fled to London. He contacted Browder, gave him financial and bank documents from Stepanov, some of which were to Swiss accounts. We don't know what deal he made, but he ended up living in a very expensive neighborhood in London. So Browder used these documents in 2011 to charge Stepanov, his ex-wife and family, with getting money from the tax refund fraud, accused them of taking $24 million, also accused Katsev, the owner of Prevezon, which was also accused of taking money, and a banker. And so that's why the Swiss were investigating. So they looked at all of these records. And by the way, because Browder was involved in the case, he had access to all of the records. He took all the information that he had, including what the Swiss had, and that the case was started in 2011. Then the next year, he gave it to the Justice Department, and that was one of the bases for the Prevezon case against Katsev, but he was very angry when the Swiss cooperated with the Russians on this matter, because the Russians were also interested in the tax refund fraud. It had cheated the Russian treasury. He was furious at that. He didn't think it was okay. That was not okay. And by the way, it's standard to have country-to-country cooperation on legal matters. But he thought it was just fine for he, as a private person, to give the documents he got to the U.S. Justice Department. So what happened? They investigated for 9 years. The Swiss investigated for 9 years. There was nothing there. There was no there. And then they announced just recently they're considering, quote, this the formal way of putting it, ending the case, unfreezing the assets, because they had frozen $20 million in assets of belonging to the people that Browder charged, and examining the status of Browder's Hermitage Capital Management as a plaintiff. But it seems after all this time, it's a formality, because if they had any reason to act on the charges, they would have done so over 9 years. And he accused the Swiss of being chummy with the Russians. And he will contest the decision. He will sue he will sue any banks that release the unfrozen funds of his victims. And if they drop him from the case, he no longer has access to the filings. So it's interesting that it started before the Magnitsky Act, and looking at the documents, though, the lawyer's letter that started this investigation. He claimed that these people, in the letter, which I put on my website, his London law firm, Brown Rudnick, started the letter by lying about Magnitsky, calling him an anti-corruption lawyer who was contracted as an external lawyer and advisor to Hermitage because of the tax refund fraud. And we know that he was an accountant. He's listed in his testimony as an auditor. He was not hired in 2007, at the date of the tax refund fraud, but 10 years earlier, he'd been working for the company Firestone Duncan, handling Browder's accounts and managing his tax evasion. And so the lawyer's letter, and they also attached a 111-page document with all of the files that Browder gave them, and that's also linked on my website, that obviously did not impress the Swiss. So that is a big and very important loss. And we have one funny thing. Of course, Browder made a lot of statements to the press, and they always take down as good stenographers everything he says. He told one paper, and I enjoyed this: the termination of the investigation is an invitation for money launderers to come to Switzerland. Here they have nothing to fear. Well, that is so funny because Browder has laundered his profits through offshore accounts in the Isle of Man, the British Virgin Islands, Cyprus, and more. So he knows exactly how money launderers use offshore because he is one. The case would have ended next year anyway because there's a statute of limitations, and if nothing happens in 10 years, it's over. So that is the second big loss for Browder, and very, very good decision on the part of the Swiss.
That's pretty wild. Did the Swiss give the specific reason as to why they basically didn't go through with it or didn't pick up the case?
Well, the evidence didn't go anywhere. They did say they found between 1 million and 4 million, and they have to find out where that came from, and if it's possible that it came from some illegal activities, they would maintain the freezing on that. They initially, there was 24 million that Browder wanted frozen. But now they have evidence maybe 1 to 4 million if they find links to crimes committed in Russia, and none of that relates to the tax refund fraud. So they didn't bring the case because, look, for people that want to go through it, look on my website. The story is it's about the Swiss. And so you'll see the headline about the Swiss decision. If you go down further, I link to this 111 pages, which includes all the documents. There's nothing there. You know, they're charts and there are lines of this went from here to there, but there's no evidence. Anybody can write a chart, and he's very good at, Browder's very good at that, doing charts and say the money went from this bank to that bank to that bank, but do you have the actual documents, the bank transfer documents? Well, not really. And that's what, if the Swiss and other countries have what they call MLAT, M-L-A-T, which is the legal term for justice departments cooperating with each other. They make a request.
It's a mutual legal assistance treaty, right?
Right. And they make a request. Usually it goes through the State Departments, the foreign ministries, but it's initiated by the justice departments of the countries, and they make a request for cooperation. This is standard. So if there was anything there that the Swiss needed to see, something from a bank, they would make an MLAT request to the country where the bank existed and ask to see the documents. And they've had 9 years to work on this, and they've gotten nothing. They've gotten no evidence of that. Of course, they have to drop the case, because suppose they brought the case and then they had no evidence. You know, you can't bring a case with no evidence. Browder can talk a lot about his claims with no evidence, but a real case in a court, you have to have evidence, and that's why they finally are saying they're dropping the case, which would have been dropped anyway next year.
And here's the thing, is that Browder does not seem to do particularly well when he tries to go through the judicial system, whether it was his deposition in the Prevezon case or the libel case with, I'm forgetting the name, but the one of the Russians who Browder was making all sorts of libelous statements against. This is featured.
That was in London.
That's exactly in England.
The only time he's whenever he's gone to a court of law, he loses. So that was the decision about Pavel Karpov, who brought a defamation case, and Justice Simon in London ruled that he didn't have a reputation to protect in England because he didn't live in England, or he didn't travel to England. He was in Russia, and therefore there wasn't a proper jurisdiction. But he said if Browder continued to make these defamatory remarks against Pavel Karpov, there's nothing that says that Justice Simon, would not take up the case. And he basically said that Browder had told lies about Karpov, accusing him of being responsible for the death of Magnitsky. And he said, and Simon said, Karpov was a tax investigator. And there's no evidence that he was responsible for the death of Magnitsky, of anybody. And it was clear. So that was a judgment. Here's another judgment. In the U.S. federal court, the Justice Department agreed to end the case because it had no evidence. And Katsev of Prevazon agreed to end the case and pay $6 million because he didn't have the deep pockets of the Justice Department. It was costing him a fortune to pay expensive lawyers. It would have cost him another fortune if it would have been a trial, at least of another month going on, because they ended it in 2017. And I went to the hearings where this was all discussed, where the evidence was being put forward that would be used. And by the way, the judge, Pauley, refused to accept some of the evidence that the Justice Department wanted to put in, such as this fake, this is also by a Swiss, but not the Swiss government. A guy named Andreas Gross did a report which was bandied about by Browder a lot, adopted by PACE, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and it was a fake. And Pauley said it was not reliable because it only talked to Browder. So anytime there's been an actual judges or judicial people other than the Americans who bought and paid for to do anything against the Russians, any objective judicial decisions have gone against Browder. And that's
against Browder and his case.
And his case.
Lucy, we've got to bring you back on some other time. I know it's admittedly murky for some of the audience, and for folks who haven't been following Fault Lines for a long time. If you're members of Jamarl's audience, admittedly, you probably don't know a lot about this stuff just because it's not that well covered, frankly, in the United States. And when it is, it's pretty much universally miscovered. As you can hear, a lot of the ways that it's reported in the U.S. are complete misreporting, 100% based on Browder's narrative of events, which, again, suits the West in some ways, but ultimately I would say does a disservice to our relationship with not just Russia, but through these sanctions to much of the rest of the world. In any event, we have to cut it short here. Lucy, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this.
You're very welcome. I'm always glad to be on the show.
For everybody listening, Lucy Komisar, we're always glad to have you. Lucy Komisar is an investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. You can and you should follow Lucy on Twitter at Lucy Komisar and read her articles at thekomisarscoop.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back taking calls on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And you could be listening to voices from the audience, too. Our phone lines are currently open, 202-521-1320 or 202-521-1320. Here's the thing, Jamarl. Admittedly, this story is a little bit, for most folks, it's recherche. It kind of comes out of nowhere, and you got to look long and hard to find the real facts about it. But it's important, not just in terms of the relationship between U.S. and Russia. It's important in terms of like the history, the economic history. In the 90s, Russia went through shock therapy. I know you're familiar with that. And in the process, 90s, early 2000s, in the process, a lot of companies, a lot of effectively Russian resources were bought up for pennies on the dollar by investors in the West, including the United States. And it was effectively vulture capitalism, where you have, foreign investors coming in to pick clean the remnants of the Soviet Union to the detriment, and it was not a mild form of detriment, to many lives lost, intense economic hardship suffered by citizens of what is now the Russian Federation. So it left this massive legacy, like a massive stain on relations between Russia and the West and Russia and the U.S. So there's a moral case to be made here. It also, specifically the Magnitsky-Browder era that we're talking about in the 2000s, that was in some sense one of the first resumptions of conflict between Russia and the United States. After Putin came to power, things were okay for a little while. You remember, during Obama's early years, he was quote unquote soft on Putin, according to the neocons in Congress and intelligence agencies associated with it. But he wasn't just soft on him. But this blow, along with the United States overthrow of the Ukrainian government, along with what happened in Ukraine, and how those policies continued in Syria, in the Middle East, this was one of the major ways in which relationships between Russia and the United States soured. So it's important from that perspective. And it's also important if you look at how the United States uses sanctions as this economic weapon, a sort of blunt cudgel to try to block off foreign actors, foreign folks, basically, in various ways, either to disempower them or literally, in the case of freezing their assets, to actually expropriate their wealth. And in the long run, what I'm worried about, what I foresee happening, because frankly it already is you recreate a sort of globally divided economic system where, while we're talking a good talk about fair trade and the globalization of economies, we are using these sanctions as leverage to try to extract concessions from political opponents in our country and abroad. And in the process, we're lying to ourselves. We're doing a disservice to, what ideally should be some diplomatic harmony between great powers on issues of key importance. Anyway, I've been talking your ear off about this stuff. But for the audience's sake, I think it's an important story. I'm glad we're covering. Anywho, we're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We've got Karen calling in from Maryland. Karen, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hi, it's been a while. Is this open mic, or do you want me to stick to a certain subject? Because I can call back on another day if this is not the right day for my topic. It's about the elections. Is that all right?
Go right ahead.
Okay, good answer. Okay, I had a piece of advice for somebody who was in a position that they had to get along with somebody that they didn't vote alike. Like maybe, you and your co-host don't vote alike. That's possible, okay? What I had to do was I called the elections board in my state, and I found out how they counted write-ins, okay? And if somebody's name is already on the ballot, but you prefer to write in their name in the write-in slot, it still counts. At least in Maryland it does. But you have to check out what the rules are in your state. So if you prefer to be able to get along with somebody and not tell them that you voted for somebody that they wouldn't approve of you voting for, you can just go ahead and tell them that you did a write-in vote if it will count as though you marked their name on the ballot. So if you would prefer not to say that's none of your business, if you would prefer not to say that's private or that's personal, you can just go ahead and say I did a write-in. And then, since everybody has the attitude that write-ins aren't going to amount to anything, it doesn't make a lot of difference after that. But that's a way to handle it if you prefer not to wear out your welcome with somebody and you don't vote the same way that they do.
Karen, that is awesome. I appreciate that. I have to be honest. My wife will tell you, and I would tell you, I would rather lose a friend than a fight. I would rather stand by a particular position and be there by myself as opposed to have to pretend and hide a vote. I don't necessarily believe that the person is your friend or the person is, if they're going to be that hard on you where you can't necessarily be honest about your vote. But I do understand where you're coming from, right? If you're, let's say, a spouse or in a marriage, even with that, I don't know. I can't wrap my head around the situation of having to be dishonest about that. You know what I mean? If that makes sense, Shane?
That's the way to be. Straight up. You want to I think that's the way to be a genuine human being for the most part, is you say what you believe, and you listen to other people when they say you're wrong, and you try to listen to the truth, and you change your opinion when you're wrong, but you say what you believe and you stand by it, Anyway, that's an extremely abstract response to that question. But 202-521-1320 is the number to call, 202-521-1320.
No, but I appreciate the point, Karen. I do appreciate the point. And look, I mean, I've had friends of mine who we got into very big fights over the election where we're no longer friends. It was at my wedding, for to put it in perspective, and could not get over this notion of quote unquote the Russians helping Trump beat Clinton. And it's like, yeah, man, they're gonna perp walk Trump. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. Or yeah, man, I mean, he asked the Russians for help. Okay, when did that happen? Well, when he was on the campaign stump. Oh, you mean when he was on the stage? Yes. Okay, fair enough. You believe that that's association and getting help? Yes. And it's like, after a while, it's like, all right, dude, you need to let this go. Because you sound ridiculous right now. Because you can't tell me what evidence you have. You can't pinpoint it. You can't show me anything. You have a bunch of Democrats and Rachel Maddow telling you something that you can't verify. He's like, well, watch. Trump is going to be prosecuted. Okay. Now, what has happened over the course of 3 years? One shoe after another dropped that showed that he was sniffing helium and basically listened to anybody that would explain why Donald Trump won the race as opposed to Hillary Clinton just basically flaming out and losing. And, it's one of those things, right? It's like, so should I get an apology for that? Should I get, hey, man, you were absolutely and entirely right. My political acumen was nowhere to be found. My wife pretty much says, yeah, don't do that. She's like, if that's where you're going to go, just leave it. But that's
probably,
but I got to be honest, you shouldn't have to do that. Like, you shouldn't have to have that fight. And you know what's wilder? When I was a Democrat, he was for the Greens. He's the one who started me off in that thought of like, hey, maybe Democrats are, maybe this guy's right. He did that. Like, he doesn't remember this, but he used to be for the Greens. He was the one when I was in the Obama camp and everybody else, he was for the Greens. And so it's like this thing has entirely flipped. So bizarre.
You would have thought he knew. No, that's interesting. No, I mean, and I'm not saying you should be undiplomatic about it. You can say what you mean kindly. You can say what you mean while listening to what the other person has to say. And there are different ways to say what you mean. It doesn't sound like that was too heinous. I mean, I'll be honest. If we lived I'll bring it back to Star Trek. If we lived in a sort of Vulcan world or a more Vulcan-like society, it would be cool if you disagree over something factual and then you just make a bet with the other person about it. And admittedly, I don't want to be the jerk who actually does that, but because it would be considered pretty jerkish to do that every time you have some serious disagreement. But at least you've got your money on the line. At least you're making some sort of personal investment in your epistemological convictions. At least there's some link between what you're saying and what you have some skin in the game. You have something on the line that you can actually afford to lose for saying ridiculous things or for saying at least unfounded things. I don't know, Jamarl. What's your take on that?
The problem is that people do have skin on the line in politics. I mean, that's kind of why it hits skin deep sometimes. I mean, if in his head, Donald Trump is going to end the world because he's been listening to Rachel Maddow tell him that Donald Trump was going to end the world. And Donald Trump has been saying these kind of just weird, bombastic, utterly ridiculous things. Well, he's not insane for thinking that because I am not on his side about it or because I'm looking at him like, dude, you've lost your mind, especially when his reality is entirely the entire opposite. Like, all of those people lost their mind. That book was named Shattered for a reason. They were shattered. I don't think it's insane, for him to feel some kind of way about it. And for him, skin is in the game. And I think that's kind of the issue, right?
What does he lose? What do they lose? That's the thing. Is that, I mean, you say they have skin in the game. We've got 30 seconds, whatever left.
They're looking at this from a civil rights issue. They're looking at this from the standpoint of Trump being entirely unpredictable in the standpoint of the presidency. They're looking at, think about the marches and stuff that took place immediately after. They weren't, they were freaked out. But I'm sorry.
Well, but it was those marches can be fun. I was there for the Women's March. And people were having a lot of fun. Sure, the rhetoric was about being freaked out, but people were really engaged. It was a good time. At this point, the Democratic Party is intact and Biden is president after a single term from Trump. Now, admittedly, Trump didn't get perp walked. We'll see. But what skin did they have in the game? What did they lose for being so wrong? We've got to cut it out. We should come back to this some other time. But interesting conversations as always. Thank you to engineer Andre. Thank you to producers Cam and Raheem. Thank you to our guests for joining us this morning, Brad Blakenship and Lucy Komisar. And thank you, Jamarl Thomas, for co-hosting the show with me. We may disagree sometimes, but overall, at the end of the day, I think we keep it civil. We have fun conversations, and we disagree vociferously about important issues. And thank you, that is you, for listening to this show. And I mean you. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Have a great day. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, putting another one in the record books. All right, guys, I can't stay for today for the after show. I have a doc visit, unfortunately. It's a pain in my ass, but it's one of those things that just has to be done. But you may see me afterwards, providing nothing weird, screwy, or anything beyond the pain in the ass takes place. So, hopefully, I'll see you guys later this evening. Keep it tight. Thank you guys for joining us. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one of record books. Like, share, and of course, hit that subscription button if you are not subscribed. Thanks all.